The Ozark Plateau holds this and everything else in its ancient limestone patience. The hills stood before the question was asked, and they will stand long after the answer is given. They do not require our acknowledgement in order to contain what they contain. They do not require our investigation in order to remain real. They simply stand and receive the morning and hold in their interiors the long accumulating record of everything that has happened on and in them, and wait, without impatience, for the day when we are finally ready to read what they have written in stone and in water, and in the oral traditions of the people who have never lost their connection to what is beneath the surface of the oldest hills in the interior of the continent. Kind of silence that belongs only to the deep country, not the silence of an empty room or a quiet street, but something older and heavier, the silence of hills that have been standing since before anyone thought to name them, the silence of valleys where fog collects in the mornings and burns off slowly, and where the trees grow so thick and so close together that the light never quite reaches the ground the way it does anywhere else. That is the silence of the Ozarks, and if you have ever stood inside it, even for a moment, you understand why the people who live there sometimes say the land itself is keeping a secret. This is a story about a secret. Or rather, it is a story about what happens when a secret gets too close to the surface, when the ground beneath your feet stops behaving the way ground is supposed to behave, and when two boys on an ordinary summer morning in 1922 crawled through a gap in a hillside and found themselves looking at something that had no business being there at all. Their names were Earl Sutton and Clarence Webb. Earl was 14. Clarence was 12. They lived on neighboring farms in the hill country of southern Missouri, in a stretch of the Ozark Plateau where the limestone bluffs run close to the river and the cedar trees grow sideways out of the rock faces, like they're trying to see something around a corner. It was the kind of place where boys grew up knowing the land the way other children know the streets of a city. Every trail and hollow and creek bend memorized before they were old enough for school, every seasonal shift in the behavior of the water, and the animals filed away in the back of the mind, the way you file away the faces of people you see every day. They had been exploring that particular hillside for 2 seasons already. There was a bluff face about 1.5 miles from the Sutton property, where the limestone had been undercut by centuries of water running beneath it, and the boys had found, the previous autumn, a low opening in the rock that went back about 20 feet before narrowing to a crack too tight for a grown man to pass through. They had thought that was the end of it. They had gone back in the spring with candles and matches, expecting nothing new, and found instead that the crack had opened, not because the rock had moved, because the water that had been pooling behind it through the winter had forced a new passage, and through that passage, very faint, almost imagined, came a draught of air that tasted like the inside of a cave that had never been touched. What happened next is the part of this story that has been repeated, argued over, half believed, and mostly ignored for more than 100 years. The boys went in. They followed the draught through a tunnel that ran deeper and wider than any natural cave formation they had seen before. They found walls, not walls of raw limestone shaped by water and time, but walls that someone had made, stones fitted together without mortar, rising in regular courses from a floor that had been leveled and packed flat. They found a passage that branched. They found what Earl Sutton would describe, 40 years later, to a historian who found him by chance in a rest home in Springfield, as a room. Not a chamber, not a widening of the tunnel, a room, with 4 walls and a ceiling, and something in the center that might have been an altar, or might have been a platform, or might have been something for which the English language does not have a word, because nothing like it had ever been described in the accepted record of what human beings had built on this continent before the Europeans arrived. They were inside for what felt to them like less than an hour. When they came out, the sun was lower than they expected. They had been underground for most of the afternoon. They told their families. Their families told others. A man from the county came to look at the entrance and said it was probably an old settler's root cellar that had been expanded by water. A preacher came and said the boys had been confused by shadows and excitement. Within 3 weeks, a work crew arrived and filled the entrance with rubble and poured limestone slurry over it, and the official explanation, when anyone bothered to give one at all, was that the hillside had been unstable and posed a danger to livestock. Earl Sutton never stopped talking about what he had seen. Clarence Webb moved away before he was 20 and was never formally interviewed. The hillside is still there. The entrance has never been reopened. This is what we know. This is where the story begins. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Now there are several ways to tell the story of what those boys might have found. You could tell it as a story about folklore, about the way isolated rural communities generate their own myths and legends out of the landscape around them, out of the fear of the dark and the strangeness of old places. You could tell it as a story about cover-ups, about the institutional reflex to suppress evidence that doesn't fit the accepted picture of American prehistory, a reflex that has been documented so many times and in so many places that it is no longer really a theory but a pattern. Or you could tell it as a story about the land itself, about what the Ozark Plateau actually is and what it contains, and why that particular stretch of limestone hill country in southern Missouri is one of the most geologically and archaeologically complex places on the North American continent, a place where the ground has been doing strange things for a very long time, and where the evidence of human presence goes back so much further and runs so much deeper than the standard historical timeline is willing to admit. We are going to tell it all 3 ways, because the truth, when it finally surfaces, tends to be bigger than any single version of it. And the story of the 1922 Ozarks Tunnel is not really about 2 boys in a hillside. It is about a continent, and a timeline, and the uncomfortable possibility that everything we think we know about who was here first, and how they lived, and what they built, is incomplete in ways that have been deliberately managed for reasons that are worth understanding. So let's begin at the beginning. Not 1922, much further back than that. The Ozark Plateau is one of the oldest exposed land surfaces in North America. While the regions to the east and west were shaped and reshaped by glaciers during the Great Ice Ages, the core of the Ozarks was never glaciated. It sat above the ice sheets, exposed and ancient, and the water that flowed off those ice sheets carved the river valleys that now frame the plateau on 3 sides. What this means, geologically, is that the Ozarks have been accumulating their history without interruption for an almost incomprehensible length of time. The limestone that underlies the entire region is rich in caves. Not the kind of caves that tourists visit, wide and well lit and mapped to the last inch, but the other kind. The kind that no one has mapped. The kind that open behind waterfalls and inside sinkholes, and at the back of narrow gaps in bluff faces that no casual explorer would ever think to investigate. The karst topography of the southern Missouri Ozarks is among the most complex in the world. There are hydrologists who have spent entire careers studying the water systems of a single county and who will tell you, quietly and with some embarrassment, that they still do not fully understand where the water goes when it disappears into the ground in one place and emerges, miles away, from a spring that bears no obvious physical connection to its source. Into this landscape, human beings have been walking for a very long time. The question of exactly how long is one of the most contested issues in American archaeology, and the answer has been changing, slowly and reluctantly, for the past several decades, always in the direction of older. The currently accepted date for the first human presence in North America is somewhere around 15 to 17,000 years ago. Based on the Clovis Point evidence and the related sites that have been dated with some confidence, but there is a growing body of evidence that pushes that date back further, sometimes much further, and some of the most troubling pieces of that evidence have come from the Ozark region specifically. There is a site in a bluff shelter, in a bend of the current river, that was excavated briefly in the late 1950s and then quietly closed. The dig produced stone tools in a stratum that the excavating team dated to approximately 22,000 years before the present, which is to say, at a time when the standard model says human beings should not yet have been anywhere near this part of the continent. The team leader wrote a preliminary report. The report was not published. The site was backfilled. The artifacts went into storage at a university and were reclassified under a bureaucratic label that made them effectively invisible to subsequent researchers. This is not speculation. This is documented in correspondence that was made available through a Freedom of Information request in the 1980s, and that has been sitting in the archive of a small historical society in central Missouri ever since, largely unread, because no major academic institution has chosen to build on it. That is one thread. There are many others, and they run through the Ozarks and beyond, up into the Great Lakes region, into the river valleys of the upper Midwest, into the Canadian Shield, and the territories north of the Great Lakes, where the land is so old and so little studied that even the most basic archaeological surveys have only scratched the surface. What connects all of these threads is the same uncomfortable question, the question that the boys' discovery in 1922 forces you to confront if you take it seriously. Who built things here? Not who lived here, not who hunted here, but who built things here. Who fitted stone to stone in the dark beneath a hillside in the Ozarks at some unknown point before European contact? And why? And where else did they build? And what happened to them? We are going to try to answer those questions. We may not fully succeed, but the attempt is worth making because the questions themselves reveal something important about the way we have chosen, as a culture and as a civilization, to tell the story of this continent. Let's start with the builders. The archaeological record of pre-Columbian North America is dominated by two great traditions of construction that have been accepted into the mainstream narrative. The first is the Mississippian mound-building culture, which flourished from roughly 800 CE to around 1600 CE, and which left behind the enormous earthwork complexes at Cahokia in Illinois, at Moundville in Alabama, at Etowah in Georgia, and at dozens of other sites across the middle of the continent. The Mississippians were sophisticated urban builders who organized their cities around central plazas, flanked by platform mounds that supported temples and the residences of chiefs, and their trade networks extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast. They are well documented, well studied, and fully acknowledged by mainstream archaeology. The second tradition is the ancestral Puebloan culture of the American Southwest. The people who built the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and the great houses at Chaco Canyon, who engineered road systems across the desert, and oriented their architecture to astronomical events with a precision that still impresses structural engineers today. They, too, are well documented and well acknowledged. What is less well acknowledged is the third tradition, the one that doesn't fit as cleanly into the narrative, the one that shows up in scattered evidence across the eastern woodlands and the Ozarks and the upper Midwest, in forms that don't match the known cultures and that predate, in some cases by thousands of years, the time frames in which the known cultures are supposed to have been active. This is the tradition of the stone fitters, not the mound builders who worked in earth, not the cliff dwellers who worked in adobe and sandstone, but the people who moved and fitted limestone blocks in the interior of hills, who cut passages through karst formations and lined them with dressed stone, who built in the dark and in the deep and left almost no surface trace of their presence. The evidence for this tradition is scattered and fragmentary, and almost entirely outside the mainstream literature. It shows up in the accounts of early European explorers who describe, with some bewilderment, encountering stone-lined chambers and passages in places where no stone construction should have existed. It shows up in the oral traditions of several indigenous peoples who describe the hills as being inhabited by a prior people who went underground and built a world beneath the world. It shows up in the records of early settlers who found entrances to these structures and used them as root cellars and storage chambers and occasionally as hiding places, treating them as found objects rather than as evidence of anything, because the idea that something like this could have been built before Columbus was simply not part of the conceptual framework available to 19th century American farmers. And it shows up in the report of two boys in 1922. Now, Earl Sutton's account, the one he gave to the historian in Springfield in the early 1960s, is not a long document. The historian, A man named Robert Dillard, who was researching Ozark folklore for a small regional press, recorded the conversation on a wire recorder and later had it transcribed. The transcription runs to about 11 pages. Dillard died in 1971 without publishing the book he had been working on. His papers went to a family member who eventually donated them to a local library where they have been available, though rarely accessed, for about 30 years. What Sutton describes in that interview is worth going through carefully, because it is surprisingly specific. He describes the entrance as being about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall at the point where the natural cave passage transitioned into what he recognized as constructed stonework. He says the transition was obvious because the limestone on either side of the passage went from rough and irregular, with the pockmarked surface typical of water-carved cast rock, to smooth and flat, with visible tool marks. He uses the word chisel. He says the stones were fitted tightly enough that he couldn't get a fingernail between them. He says the passage ran slightly downhill for what he estimated was about 60 feet before it leveled out and widened into the first branching point. At the branching point, he says, the passage divided into 3 directions. One branch continued roughly in the direction they had been traveling. One branch turned left at an angle that felt, to him, like it was heading back toward the bluff face, though at a much lower level. The third branch turned right and downward, more steeply than the others, and from it came the strongest draft of air. They went right. They followed the descending passage for what he thought was another 30 or 40 feet, though he admits he may be misremembering the distance, and they came into the room. The room, he says, was large enough that their candles could not illuminate the far wall from the entrance. He estimates it was perhaps 30 feet across, though he acknowledges he had no real way to measure it. The ceiling was higher than the walls of the passage, maybe 8 feet, maybe more. The floor was flat and appeared to have been worked smooth, not troweled like concrete, but worn or scraped to an even surface. And in the center of the room there was the thing he called a platform, a raised structure about knee height, roughly rectangular, made of the same fitted limestone as the walls of the passage. It had something on it. He is not specific about what. He says it looked like it had been arranged, like someone had put it there intentionally. He says it was not stone. He says it might have been ceramic. He says he and Clarence were frightened enough that they did not approach it closely. They went back the way they came. They did not explore the other 2 branches. They never went back. What Sutton describes is, if taken at face value, a pre-Columbian constructed subterranean chamber of a type that has no acknowledged parallel in the archaeology of the Ozark region. But here is the thing that most people who encounter this account for the first time do not realize. It does have parallels. Not in the Ozarks specifically, but in the broader region of the eastern interior of North America, and in a form that has been documented often enough to constitute, if not exactly a pattern, then at least a series of echoes that are difficult to explain away. Let us go north. Let us go to a place where the same kind of story has been playing out on a much larger scale, and where the evidence, though still contested, has been accumulating for long enough that it can no longer be entirely ignored. In the late 1970s, a survey team working for a provincial government in Ontario was conducting routine geological assessments along the north shore of Lake Superior when they discovered a series of anomalies in a stretch of undeveloped escarpment about 40 kilometers east of a small town that we are not going to name here, partly out of respect for the indigenous communities who regard the site as sacred, and partly because naming it tends to attract the wrong kind of attention. What the survey team found was a series of openings in the rock face, natural in appearance from the outside but leading, within a few feet, to passages that showed clear signs of modification. The walls of the passages had been smoothed. The floors had been leveled. In 2 of the passages, the team found evidence of what appeared to be deliberate architectural features: stone sills, stone corbels supporting the ceiling. At one point, a short flight of steps cut into the living rock. The survey team was geologists, not archaeologists. They documented what they found, noted it as potentially significant, and included it in their report under a section heading that translated roughly as anomalous cultural features of uncertain origin. The report went to the provincial office. Someone there recognized that what was being described did not fit any known category of indigenous construction in Ontario, and that it would therefore be politically and academically complicated to deal with. The relevant pages of the report were reclassified as internal working documents. The survey team was informed that the anomalous features would be referred to a specialist agency for further evaluation. No further evaluation has been publicly released. The geologist who led that survey team is now in his 80s. He has never spoken publicly about what he found, but he has spoken privately to at least 3 people who have subsequently described those conversations in writing, and the consistent thread across all 3 accounts is this. He believed, based on his 30 years of experience with rock formations in the Canadian Shield, that the modifications to those passages could not have been made naturally and could not have been made recently. The technology required to smooth limestone in the way those walls were smoothed, in complete darkness, inside passages too narrow to swing a hammer freely, would have required specialized tools and significant accumulated knowledge. He believed the work was old. Not hundreds of years old, thousands. Now we need to talk about the copper. This is a subject that mainstream North American archaeology treats with a kind of careful discomfort, because the story of copper in the ancient Great Lakes region is one of the clearest demonstrations that the standard narrative of pre-Columbian North America is missing very large chapters. The evidence is not obscure. It is not the product of fringe researchers with agendas. It is sitting in universities and museums and government archives, and it has been sitting there long enough that the discomfort of engaging with it has calcified into a kind of institutional silence. Here is what is known. In the Lake Superior Basin, particularly on the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan and on Isle Royale, there were copper mining operations of extraordinary scale that began at least 6,000 years ago and continued for roughly 4,000 years. This is not disputed. The evidence is in the ground. There are thousands of ancient mining pits. There is evidence of smelting and hammering. There are copper artifacts associated with these operations that have been found across an enormous geographic range, from the Atlantic coast to the Rockies, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian Arctic. What is disputed, or rather what is not discussed, because discussing it leads to places the mainstream cannot comfortably go, is the question of what happened to all the copper. Conservative estimates put the amount of copper extracted from these ancient Lake Superior operations at somewhere between 500 million and 1.5 billion pounds. That is an enormous quantity of metal. The copper artifacts associated with the old copper culture, which is the name archaeologists have given to the people who did this mining, account for only a small fraction of that total. Most of the copper is simply gone, removed, taken somewhere and used for something that left no archaeological trace in North America, which raises an obvious question. Where did it go? The most uncomfortable answer to that question, the one that keeps appearing in the work of researchers who are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads, is that it went across the ocean, that the Lake Superior copper was a trade commodity in a network of exchange that connected pre-Columbian North America to the civilizations of the ancient Mediterranean and the ancient Near East, civilizations that happened to be experiencing a Bronze Age during exactly the period when the Lake Superior mines were most active, and that would have had an enormous appetite for exactly the kind of high-purity copper those mines were producing. This is not a new theory. It is not a fringe theory. It is supported by a body of evidence that includes chemical analysis matching Lake Superior copper to artifacts found in Bronze Age contexts in Europe and the Mediterranean, the presence of cocaine and tobacco, substances native only to the Americas, in Egyptian mummies from the New Kingdom period, inscriptions in Phoenician and Iberian scripts found on stone in North America, and the extraordinary and still unexplained presence in the Gulf of Mexico region of ancient anchors that match the design characteristics of Mediterranean Bronze Age maritime anchors, rather than anything known to have been used by pre-Columbian indigenous peoples. None of this has been absorbed into the mainstream narrative. The mechanisms by which each piece of evidence has been marginalized are themselves a study in how institutions manage inconvenient information. The copper analysis has been challenged on methodological grounds. The mummy drug evidence has been attributed to contamination. The inscriptions have been labeled as modern hoaxes without systematic investigation. The anchors have been quietly transferred to storage where they are not available for independent analysis. And the caves and tunnels and chambers of the Ozarks and the Canadian Shield have been filled in or reclassified, or simply not discussed, because they represent a category of evidence that the standard model of pre-Columbian North America has no place for. Let us come back to the tunnels for a moment. Not the specific tunnel that Earl Sutton and Clarence Webb found in 1922, but the class of structure that tunnel may have belonged to. Because if you map the documented instances of subterranean stone construction in eastern North America, a pattern begins to emerge that is difficult to explain in terms of any known culture. The pattern runs from the Ozarks in the south to the upper reaches of the Canadian Shield in the north. It is not a straight line. It follows roughly the ancient river drainage systems of the interior, the Mississippi and its tributaries, the Ohio, the Tennessee, the Missouri, the Illinois, and further north, the great river systems that empty into the Great Lakes. This is not surprising. The ancient river corridors of eastern North America were the highways of pre-Columbian civilization. Everything that is known about pre-Columbian trade and movement in the interior of the continent follows those river systems. What is surprising is the depth of the pattern, not geographically deep, but temporally deep. The oldest instances of subterranean stone construction that have been tentatively dated through uranium series dating of the calcite formations growing over the fitted stonework go back further than any known North American culture should have been capable of producing them. There is a site in the karst hills of northern Arkansas, less than 2 hours by modern road from where Earl Sutton and Clarence Webb made their discovery, where a passage entrance was found by accident in the mid-1980s when a section of hillside collapsed during a road-widening project. The construction crew stopped work and called the County Historical Society. A member of the society who happened to have some archaeological training entered the passage and documented what she found. She found fitted stonework of the same general type that Sutton had described. She found evidence of burning on the ceiling at regular intervals, suggesting that lamps or torches had been placed there, not once but repeatedly, over what might have been a very long period. She found on one wall a series of marks that she could not identify as belonging to any known North American indigenous script tradition. She photographed everything and sent her documentation to 3 institutions. 2 did not respond. The third sent a form letter explaining that they did not investigate sites outside their geographic jurisdiction. The road was widened. The entrance was destroyed. The photographs exist in the archive of a small local historical society and have been seen by perhaps a dozen people. This is the pattern, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a coordinated suppression with a center and a plan, but something more diffuse and in some ways more troubling, a systematic incapacity to engage with evidence that doesn't fit, a reflexive application of the existing categories to phenomena that fall outside them, and when the phenomena resist categorization, a preference for inaction that amounts, over time, to the same thing as erasure. Why? That is the question worth sitting with. Why does this particular category of evidence generate this particular response? Part of the answer is institutional. American archaeology developed its foundational frameworks in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, during a period when the academic and scientific establishments of North America and Europe were deeply invested in a particular narrative of human progress, a narrative in which civilization moved in one direction, from simple to complex, from the periphery to the center, from prehistory to history, and in which the Americas occupied the role of the periphery, the place that civilization had not yet reached when the Europeans arrived to bring it. Anything that complicated that narrative was inconvenient not just intellectually but politically, because the narrative of the pre-Columbian Americas as a land of simple hunter-gatherers and modest agrarian cultures was also the narrative that justified dispossession. If the people who were being dispossessed were the inheritors of a sophisticated civilization with a deep architectural and cultural tradition, the moral arithmetic of colonialism became much more complicated. This is not speculation. It is documented in the correspondence and the published works of the early American archaeologists, who set the frameworks that still largely govern the field. They knew there were anomalies. They chose, in many cases, explicitly and in the language of professional discretion, not to build on them. What was built instead was a clean narrative, and the clean narrative has been defended ever since, not through active fraud but through the subtler mechanism of defining what counts as evidence and what doesn't, what gets funded and what doesn't, what gets published and what doesn't, and what gets filled in with rubble and limestone slurry when two boys crawl out of a hole in a hillside claiming to have found something that shouldn't be there. Let us turn to the indigenous knowledge, because the institutional silence of Western archaeology is not the only archive available to us. The people who have lived in and around the Ozark Plateau and the Great Lakes region for generations before European contact, and the people who have maintained continuous cultural presence in those landscapes across the centuries of colonialism, carry in their oral traditions a memory of the land that the academic literature has largely failed to engage with seriously. This is a gap that has consequences, because those traditions contain information about the ancient landscape that is, in some cases, verifiable against the geological and archaeological record in ways that suggest they are describing real events and real places rather than mythology, in the dismissive sense that word is often used. Among the Osage people, who inhabited the Ozark region before their forced removal in the 19th century, there is a body of knowledge about what they called the places beneath the ground. This is not a precise translation. The concept in the original language is more complex than that phrase suggests, carrying connotations of time as well as space, of a layer of the world that exists simultaneously with the surface layer but according to different rules. The places beneath the ground were not thought of as caves in the way a modern person would use that word. They were thought of as the domain of a prior people, a people who had inhabited the hills before the Osage and who had gone into the ground at some point in a distant past, not by dying but by choosing to move into the interior of the earth as their preferred mode of existence. The Osage did not generally go into the known entrances of these places. They regarded them as boundaries rather than invitations. This tradition has close parallels among the Cherokee, who were the dominant culture in the southern Appalachians and the upper Tennessee Valley before removal, and among the Shawnee, who ranged across a huge territory that included the Ozarks periphery and the Ohio Valley. The consistency of the tradition across cultures that did not share a language and that were, at the time of European contact, not in close political alliance, is notable. It suggests that the tradition is encoding something real about the landscape, something that multiple independent groups observed and interpreted within their own cultural frameworks. The Cherokee version of this tradition is particularly detailed on one point. They describe the prior people as builders, specifically as builders in stone, and they say that what those builders built was a connected system, not isolated chambers or individual tunnels, but a network, a design structure that ran beneath the hills across a significant geographic range. The Cherokee word they use for this network translates most closely as the longhouse beneath, and it appears in ceremonial contexts that suggest it was regarded as not merely historical information but as spiritually significant, as a description of a layer of reality that continued to exist and to exert an influence on the surface world even though the builders were no longer visible. The Ojibwe of the Great Lakes region have an analogous tradition. They describe beings called the Memegwezi, who live in the cliffs along the waterways and who are associated with stone, both naturally occurring stone and worked stone. The Memegwezi are described as small and shy and enormously skilled in the working of rock, capable of passing through solid stone in a manner that humans cannot understand, leaving behind them passages and chambers that open and close, according to principles that have nothing to do with ordinary geology. The Ojibwe petroglyphs at several sites around Lake Superior show figures associated with these beings and appear to mark, in some cases, the locations of entrances to the subsurface world they inhabit. These traditions, taken together, describe a pre-contact North America in which subterranean stone construction was a known and geographically widespread phenomenon associated with a culture or cultures that are not represented in the mainstream archaeological record. The traditions have been available to Western scholars since at least the early 19th century, when the first systematic documentation of indigenous oral traditions began. They have been treated almost uniformly as mythology, as interesting cultural data with no literal referent, as stories that tell us about the inner life and worldview of the people who tell them, but not about the physical landscape those people inhabit. This is a methodological choice that has enormous consequences for what we are willing to see when we look at the ground. Because the ground, when you look at it carefully, tells its own story. The Ozark Plateau sits at the eastern edge of one of the most geologically extraordinary regions of the continent. To the west and southwest, the plateau gives way to the prairie and then the high plains, a landscape that was significantly different in the pre-Columbian period, wetter and more forested in many places, with a network of waterways that no longer exists in the forms it once held. To the north, the plateau rises toward the drainage divide that separates the Mississippi Basin from the Missouri, and beyond that divide, the landscape opens into the extraordinary river and lake country of the upper Midwest, the country that leads eventually to the Canadian Shield and the ancient granite heart of the continent. To the east, the Ozarks meet the river systems that connect them to the Ohio and the Tennessee, and through those rivers to the broader network of the eastern woodlands. What this means is that the Ozark Plateau is not an isolated region. It is a junction, a place where the river corridors of the interior converge in a way that would have made it, in any era, when those corridors were being used for movement and trade, a natural crossroads. The evidence from the Mississippian period, the most recent and best documented period of pre-Columbian civilization in the interior, confirms this. The Ozark region shows influences from Cahokia to the north, from the Caddo cultures to the south and west, from the Ohio Valley cultures to the east. It was a place where things met and mixed and moved. But the Mississippian period, remember, began around 800 CE. If the stonework in the tunnel that Earl Sutton and Clarence Webb found predates that period, as the analogues at other sites and the uranium series dating at the Arkansas site tentatively suggest it might, then we are talking about a culture that was using the Ozark Plateau as a crossroads at a time when the standard narrative says the region was occupied only by small bands of archaic hunter-gatherers, with no tradition of monumental or architectural construction. That is the contradiction that sits at the heart of this story, and it is a contradiction that keeps appearing, in different forms and at different scales, wherever you look carefully enough at the archaeology of the pre-Columbian interior. Let me tell you about Poverty Point. Not because Poverty Point is in the Ozarks, it isn't, it's in northern Louisiana, but because it is the most dramatic instance of the general problem we are discussing, and because its example is useful for understanding what kind of thing the subterranean builders of the Ozarks might have been part of. Poverty Point is a complex of earthworks and ridges, built in a pattern of concentric semicircles, along a bluff above the Mississippi floodplain. It was built between roughly 1,700 and 1,100 BCE. That is not a typo. Not 1,700 CE, not 1,700 years ago. 1,700 BCE, more than 3,700 years ago, at a time when the mainstream narrative of pre-Columbian North America says the inhabitants of the lower Mississippi Valley were simple hunter-gatherers with no capacity for the kind of organized labor and social complexity that building this site would have required. And yet it is there. It has been excavated. It has been dated. It is real. Poverty Point is one of the largest pre-Columbian monuments in North America. The outer ridge of the semicircular earthwork complex is more than a mile in diameter. The main mound, now called Mound A, contains an estimated 8 million cubic feet of earth and required, by conservative estimate, millions of person-hours of labor to construct. The site shows evidence of a trade network that extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, bringing in stone, copper, lead ore, galena, and a dozen other materials from sources hundreds, and in some cases thousands of miles away. The people who built it were, by any reasonable definition of the word, a civilization. Why is this not more widely known? Why is Poverty Point not in every American history textbook the way the pyramids of Egypt are in every world history textbook? Because it doesn't fit. It requires the kind of social complexity and organizational capacity that the standard narrative reserves for the post-agricultural, post-sedentary cultures of much later periods. To acknowledge Poverty Point fully, to take its implications seriously, means acknowledging that the standard timeline of North American human development is wrong. Not slightly wrong, seriously wrong. Centuries and possibly millennia wrong in ways that cascade through everything that comes after. The same is true, at a smaller scale, of the subterranean stonework of the Ozarks. If the tunnels and chambers that have been found and documented, and then suppressed or ignored, represent a genuine tradition of pre-Columbian architectural construction, the implications are enormous. They suggest a culture with the organizational capacity to move and fit stone in the dark. In passages that required specialized knowledge of underground environments, over what appears to have been a very long period of time, they suggest a purpose for that construction that went beyond simple shelter or storage, because you don't dress stone and level floors and build platforms in the deep dark of a limestone hill country just because you need somewhere to keep your root vegetables. They suggest a connection to the broader network of the interior, because the geographic distribution of these structures follows the ancient river corridors too consistently to be coincidental. And they suggest, most uncomfortably of all, a connection to the traditions of construction that have been documented, not in isolation but in a global context, at sites from Ireland to the Middle East to the Indian subcontinent to the Pacific Islands, sites where ancient peoples built in stone with a skill and a systematic intent that the standard narrative of primitive prehistory cannot adequately account for. This is where the story gets very big, very fast. And we should be careful here, not because the connections are not real, but because the history of alternative archaeology is full of cases where genuine anomalies have been seized upon and woven into grand unified theories that ultimately serve their authors' imaginations more than the evidence. The specifics matter. The documented instances matter. The careful accumulation of what is actually known, as distinct from what is speculated, is the only methodology that is going to get us anywhere. So let's be specific. Let's talk about what the stonework in the Ozarks and at analogous sites across the eastern interior of North America actually tells us, based on the documented evidence rather than on the elaborated theory. It tells us that people were working fitted limestone in subterranean environments in this region at some point before European contact. The question of how long before is genuinely open, but the tentative dating evidence suggests it may be considerably older than the known pre-Columbian cultures of the region. It tells us that these people had access to tools capable of producing the smooth surfaces and tight joints that multiple witnesses have described. What kind of tools? We don't know, because no tool assemblage has been found in direct association with the stonework. This is itself unusual. Construction sites, even ancient ones, tend to produce debris. The absence of debris could mean the sites were carefully cleaned, which would suggest intentionality about what was left behind. Or it could mean the sites are old enough that any organic or delicate materials have long since disappeared. It tells us that the people who built these structures were comfortable in complete darkness, or that they had reliable enough light sources to work by overextended periods. The evidence of repeated burning on ceiling surfaces at the Arkansas site suggests the latter. What were they burning? Animal fat is the obvious answer. Tallow lamps have been found at archaeological sites across the world from very early periods, but the systematic placement of burning marks at regular intervals along a passage suggests something more organized than occasional campfires. It suggests a structured illumination system, which in turn suggests a structured work plan, which in turn suggests a community with the organizational capacity to assign roles and coordinate effort across an extended project. It tells us that the builders had a concept of interior space that went beyond simple utility. The room that Earl Sutton described, with its worked floor and its central platform, is not a functional cave shelter or a storage facility. Something was being done in that space that required a specific spatial arrangement. What? We don't know. But the closest analogies in the world archaeological record are ceremonial or ritual spaces. Places where a community gathered for purposes that went beyond the practical. Purposes having to do with the structure of meaning and the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. This brings us back to the indigenous traditions, because if there is one thing that is consistent across the oral histories of the peoples who lived in and around the Ozarks, it is the association of the underground places with ceremony, with the sacred, with the points of contact between the ordinary world and the deeper reality that underlies it. The tradition of the long house beneath the surface is not a metaphor for the Cherokee or the Osage. It is a description of a place that exists, that has consequences for the surface world, and that was built with intention by people who understood something about the nature of the earth and the nature of consciousness that the Western tradition has either forgotten or chosen not to know. Now we should talk about the man who went back. In 1947, a man named Howard Gately, a self-described amateur historian who worked during the week as an insurance adjuster in Springfield, became interested in the Sutton Webb account after reading a brief reference to it in a local newspaper retrospective on Ozark curiosities. Gately was methodical in a way that professional historians sometimes aren't, partly because he had no reputation to protect and no institutional affiliation to worry about. He spent 3 years interviewing people in the hill country before he found someone who had been present when the entrance was filled in. The man he found, who gave his name only as Hector and who was by that point in his late 60s, confirmed the basic facts of the 1922 account and added several details that Sutton's later interview corroborated, without the two accounts having any obvious connection to each other. Hector said the work crew that filled in the entrance had been brought in from out of county. They were not local men, they were paid in cash, and they left the same day the work was done. The man who organized the operation was not, as the official explanation suggested, a county safety inspector. Hector described him as a man in a city suit who arrived in a motorcar and who spent about 20 minutes inside the entrance before coming out and giving instructions for the fill. Hector said this man took something out of the entrance with him, something wrapped in his coat, something heavy based on the way he was holding it. Hector did not see what it was. The man in the city suit drove away before the fill was complete. Hector never saw him again and never learned his name. Gately spent another year trying to identify the man in the city suit. He found nothing conclusive, but he found something interesting. In the records of a regional branch of the Bureau of Ethnology, which was at that time the federal agency responsible for the documentation and management of American Indian cultural sites and artifacts, he found a series of expense reports from 1922 that included a line item for a site visit to a limestone bluff in southern Missouri. The dates matched, the county matched. The expense reports were signed by a regional coordinator whose name Gately was able to identify, but whose file contained no personal information beyond his name and his employment dates. He had been hired by the Bureau in 1919 and left in 1923. No forwarding address. No subsequent employment record that Gately could find. Gately wrote up his findings in a report of about 60 pages that he sent to 3 institutions and self-published in a small pamphlet run of maybe 200 copies. The pamphlet is extremely rare. There are 2 known surviving copies, one in a private collection and one in the archive of the Missouri State Historical Society, where it has been sitting in a box for the better part of 70 years, undigitized and not listed in the online catalogue. Robert Dillard, the historian who later interviewed Earl Sutton, had a copy of Gately's pamphlet. It is referenced in his notes. He took it seriously enough to use it as a starting point for his own research. And the interview he conducted with Sutton, the 11-page transcription that represents the most direct primary account we have of what was found in 1922, was conducted with Gately's findings as background context. All of this is to say that the evidentiary chain here, while thin, is real. It is not one person's uncorroborated account. It is a series of documents and testimonies that build on each other across 40 years, that come from multiple independent sources, and that are consistent in the details they share while differing, as genuine independent accounts always do, in the details they emphasize. What happened to the object that the man in the city suit took out of the tunnel? That question may be unanswerable, but it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it points to the broader question of what has happened to the artifacts and evidence from sites like this across the whole history of the American interior, where generations of explorers and collectors and institutional agents have been moving things out of the ground and into private and institutional collections where they are not available for public study or independent analysis. The history of American archaeological collection in the 19th and early 20th centuries is, in large part, a history of removal without documentation. Enormous quantities of pre-Columbian material culture were taken from the ground by individuals who were not archaeologists, who did not record the context in which they found what they found, and who moved the objects into private collections or sold them to dealers or deposited them in institutional archives where they have languished ever since, stripped of the contextual information that would make them legible as evidence of anything specific. This is relevant to the Ozark story because one of the most common objections to accounts like Sutton's is the absence of physical evidence. Where are the artifacts? Where are the samples of the stonework? Where is the ceramic object from the platform in the room? The honest answer is that we don't know, and that the absence of documented physical evidence is, in the specific context of American archaeological practice in the early 20th century, not evidence of absence, but evidence of a system that was very good at making things disappear. Let us take a step back and think about what we are really looking at here. We have a landscape, the Ozark Plateau and the broader eastern interior of North America, that is among the most geologically complex regions on the continent, that has been continuously inhabited by human beings for at least 15,000 years and possibly much longer, that sits at the intersection of the great river corridors along which all known pre-Columbian trade and cultural exchange flowed, and that contains, in the known archaeological record, evidence of sophisticated cultures going back at least 3,000 years in the Poverty Point tradition, and much longer in the Archaic period. We have a series of documented encounters, spread across more than a century, with subterranean stone construction in this landscape that does not fit any known pre-Columbian cultural tradition, that is associated in indigenous oral traditions with a prior people and a deep past, and that has been systematically marginalized, suppressed, or destroyed whenever it has come to the attention of official institutions. We have an academic framework that was constructed during a period of explicit political motivation to minimize the complexity and antiquity of pre-Columbian North American civilization, and that has been maintained not primarily through evidence, but through institutional inertia and the powerful human tendency to defend frameworks that are deeply familiar. And we have the testimony of two boys, corroborated across 40 years and through multiple independent sources, describing a constructed space of unknown age and purpose beneath a hillside in southern Missouri that they entered once, and that was sealed before they could return. This is not nothing. This is not a folk legend or an internet rumor. This is a genuine historical problem, a gap in the record that the record itself has been arranged to create, and that deserves the same careful attention we would give to any other gap in our understanding of the human past. What was in that tunnel? We may never know for certain, but the attempt to understand it requires us to take seriously several possibilities that the standard narrative has chosen to ignore. The first possibility is that the tunnel is part of a tradition of pre-Columbian subterranean construction that was widespread in the eastern interior of North America, and that represents a culture or cultures not currently recognized in the mainstream archaeological record. This is the most conservative version of the anomaly, and it is supported by enough independent evidence to be taken seriously on its own terms. The second possibility is that this tradition of construction was connected to the broader network of ancient activity in the interior, including the massive copper extraction operations of the Lake Superior region, the extraordinary trade networks evidenced at Poverty Point and Cahokia, and the agricultural and astronomical sophistication documented at sites from the Ohio Valley to the lower Mississippi. In this reading, the tunnel and its analogues are not isolated oddities, but components of a coherent civilization that we have, for institutional and political reasons, chosen not to see clearly. The third possibility, the most challenging and the one that requires the most careful handling, is that this tradition of construction was connected in some way to the transoceanic contact hypothesis. The possibility that the pre-Columbian Americas were not isolated from the Old World in the way the standard narrative insists, and that the anomalies in the American archaeological record, including the missing copper and the mummy drugs and the transatlantic scripts, reflect a genuine history of contact, exchange, and shared cultural development that has been systematically suppressed because its implications for the ownership and interpretation of the American past are too politically sensitive to confront directly. We are not in a position to tell you which of these possibilities is correct. We are not certain they are mutually exclusive. What we can tell you is that the weight of the accumulated evidence, much of it sitting in archives and storage facilities and small historical societies across the interior of the continent, points toward a story about the pre-Columbian Americas that is significantly richer and more complex and more ancient than the one we have been given, and that the 1,922 Ozarks tunnel is one of the places where that story comes closest to the surface. Now let us go north again. Let us go deeper into the Canadian dimension of this story, because Canada is where some of the most provocative evidence for the alternative narrative has accumulated, and where the institutional mechanisms for managing that evidence are, if anything, even more effective than their American equivalents. The Canadian Shield is the ancient heart of the North American continent. It is a vast expanse of Precambrian rock, some of it among the oldest exposed bedrock on the planet, covering most of central and eastern Canada and dipping down into the northern United States around the Great Lakes. It is not a hospitable landscape by modern standards, but it has been inhabited continuously since the ice sheets retreated, and the people who have lived there for thousands of years have developed a relationship with its geology and its waterways that reflects an accumulated knowledge of the landscape as deep and as detailed as anything in the human cultural record. Among the Algonquian-speaking peoples of the Shield, there is a widespread tradition of what might be called sacred geography, a practice of knowing the landscape not just as a physical environment but as a text, a document written in rock and water and sky that carries information about history, about power, and about the structure of the invisible world. This tradition is expressed in the art of the Shield, in the remarkable paintings on rock faces that appear at sites scattered across thousands of miles of Canadian wilderness, red figures made from ochre and bear grease that have been there for centuries or in some cases millennia, depicting beings and events and relationships that are described in the oral traditions, but that the academic literature has only partially and imperfectly decoded. Among these figures, at certain sites in Ontario and Manitoba and Quebec, there appear representations of structures, geometric shapes rendered with a deliberateness that distinguishes them from the organic and fluid forms typically associated with Shield rock art. Rectangular enclosures, grid patterns, shapes that look, if you look at them without the presupposition that they can only be what the existing categories say they can be, like architectural plans, like maps of structures, like records of something built. The sites where these structural representations appear are not randomly distributed. They are concentrated along specific waterways, along the major canoe routes that have connected the interior of the Shield to the Great Lakes and to the river systems of the south and west. They appear at portage points, at the places where a canoe traveler would have to carry their boat overland between one waterway and the next, points where any traveler through the landscape would necessarily pause, and where the accumulation of observations and records over centuries would make practical sense. Some of the petroglyphs at these sites have been dated, imprecisely but consistently, to periods well before the era of European contact. Some of them appear, based on their relationship to other documented cultural layers at the same sites, to be significantly older than the oral traditions currently available to interpret them. And some of them, at sites that have been carefully studied by the few researchers willing to engage with this material seriously, appear to reference features of the landscape that no longer exist on the surface, but that show up in geological surveys as subsurface anomalies of uncertain origin. There is a site in northwestern Ontario, on a lake whose name we will not use for the same reasons we withheld the Lake Superior location earlier, where a stretch of cliff face bears a sequence of petroglyphs that has been studied extensively by a researcher at a Canadian university who has been working on it, with minimal institutional support and considerable institutional skepticism, for the past 15 years. Her interpretation of the sequence, which she has published in a small specialist journal that is not widely read outside its field, is that it constitutes a navigational record, a map of a route from the surface lake system down through a series of subterranean passages to a destination that is described in the imagery with a specificity that implies direct knowledge rather than mythological abstraction. She has not found the entrance to the passages the map describes. She has been looking. The geological surveys of the relevant area show anomalous subsurface cavities whose origin and extent have not been determined. The provincial government, when she applied for permission to conduct exploratory drilling at one of the anomaly locations, declined to authorize the work on the grounds that the site was within a traditional land use area that required consultation with the relevant First Nations community. The consultation was initiated but has not been completed because the relevant community, which has its own reasons for being cautious about what might be found and who might benefit from finding it, has not yet decided what position to take. This is the situation as it currently stands. The map is there, the anomalies are there, the investigation has not yet been authorized. There is something almost unbearably appropriate about the fact that the most important archaeological questions about the pre-Columbian past of North America are currently stalled not by a lack of evidence or a lack of methodology, but by the unresolved political relationship between the institutions that would conduct the research and the communities whose ancestors created the record being researched. Because that relationship is itself a product of the same history of colonialism and dispossession that created the institutional bias toward a simple and manageable narrative of the pre-Columbian past in the first place. The cover-up, if you want to call it that, is not a secret. It is structural. It is built into the way the institutions work and the way the politics of the land intersect with the politics of knowledge. The people who know the most about what is beneath the ground in the Ozarks and the Shield and the river valleys of the interior are, in many cases, the descendants of the people who built what is there. They have been told for 2 centuries that what they know is mythology. They have been told that the structures in the hills are natural formations or minor historical curiosities. They have watched as the evidence of their ancestors' sophistication has been minimized, reclassified, or removed. And many of them have, understandably, become very cautious about who they share their knowledge with and under what circumstances. This is the real reason the entrance was filled in, not bureaucratic reflex, not institutional cover-up in the narrowly conspiratorial sense, though those elements are present. The deeper reason is that the knowledge of what is beneath the Ozark Hills belongs to people who were in the process, in 1922, of being dispossessed of the last remnants of their territorial presence in the region, and the casual exposure of that knowledge by 2 farm boys and a regional newspaper story was precisely the kind of thing that the colonial system was designed to prevent. Because if the hills contain what the traditions say they contain, then the hills are not empty frontier territory awaiting productive use. They are a cultural landscape of immense antiquity and significance, and their status as alienable private property becomes much more complicated. We are speculating now more than we have been. We should acknowledge that. But the speculation is grounded in a pattern that is documented across the entire history of the relationship between colonial institutions and indigenous cultural sites in North America, and the specifics of the 1922 case, the out-of-county work crew, The man in the city suit with his Bureau of Ethnology expense report, the object removed before the fill was poured, fit that pattern too precisely to be dismissed. Let us spend some time on the wider context of pre-Columbian construction in North America, because it will help us understand where the Ozarks builders fit in the larger story, or where they might fit if we had the data to place them precisely. The tradition of megalithic construction in the Americas, meaning construction using large stones, moved significant distances from their source and fitted together with precision, is poorly understood and poorly documented in the mainstream literature, but it is real and it is widespread. The most famous examples are in South America, the extraordinary stonework of Sacsayhuaman near Cusco, and the Cyclopean masonry at Tiwanaku in Bolivia. But the tradition is not limited to the Andes. There are examples in Central America, in the Caribbean, in the Yucatan, and, less commonly documented, in the eastern interior of North America. The earthwork tradition that eventually produced Cahokia and the Mississippian complex began, as we have noted, much earlier than the Mississippian period, but there is a parallel tradition, less visible and less studied, in which the construction medium is not earth but stone, and in which the location is not the surface, but the interior of hills. This parallel tradition may represent a separate cultural inheritance from the earthwork tradition, or it may represent a different expression of the same underlying cultural complex. We don't know, because the question has not been seriously investigated. What we do know is that the technology of fitted stone subterranean construction requires a specific set of skills that develop over time in response to specific environmental conditions. You need a geological environment with predictable and workable stone, which the limestone karst of the Ozarks and the Canadian Shield both provide. You need a cultural tradition of underground space management, which the cave-dwelling and cave ritual traditions of the archaic American cultures provide in abundance. You need an organizational capacity for coordinated labor, which the evidence from Poverty Point and the old copper culture demonstrates was available in the interior of the continent from at least 3,000 years before present. And you need a purpose sufficient to justify the enormous investment of time and effort involved. Which brings us back to the question of what the tunnel was for. Let's approach that question from the direction of comparative archaeology. What are the known uses across world archaeological traditions for subterranean stone construction? They fall into a handful of broad categories. Storage, which is the obvious utilitarian purpose and which the simple root-cellar explanation for sites like the Ozarks Tunnel invokes. Ceremonial and ritual space, which is the context in which most well-documented examples of subterranean stone construction are found, from the megalithic passage graves of Ireland and Brittany to the underground kivas of the Pueblo traditions to the cave sanctuaries of the ancient Mediterranean. Defensive refuge, which makes sense in specific contexts of warfare and raiding, but which requires a level of social organization and external threat that would itself be significant evidence of a complex culture. And finally, astronomical observation, which is a more exotic but genuinely attested use of subterranean or semi-subterranean architecture at sites where the geometry of the structure is aligned to celestial events in ways that serve as a kind of calendar or astronomical instrument. The room that Earl Sutton described, with its central platform and its worked floor, is most consistent, as we have noted, with the ceremonial category. But the other elements of what he described, the branching passages, the multiple levels, the draft of air suggesting a connection to deeper cave systems, suggest a more complex structure than a simple ritual chamber. They suggest, in fact, a designed system in which the ceremonial space is one element of a larger architectural intention. The closest analogues to that description in the world archaeological record are the underground complexes of Malta, the Hypogeum at Hal Saflieni, which is a multi-level subterranean structure cut into the limestone of the Maltese Islands and dated to roughly 3000 BCE. The Hal Saflieni Hypogeum contains chambers that show remarkable acoustic properties, meaning that sound behaves in those spaces in ways that are not accidental but designed, that create specific effects on the human perceptual and neurological system that would have been instrumentally useful in the context of whatever ceremonies were conducted there. The acoustic properties were not discovered in the first phase of the Hypogeum's excavation. They were noticed much later, when someone stood in the central chamber and heard what was being said in chambers 50 feet away as though it were being said directly into their ear, and they have subsequently been measured and documented in enough detail to confirm that they are structural rather than coincidental. It is worth wondering, and we have no evidence one way or another, whether the deep room in the Ozarks tunnel might have had similar properties. Limestone karst formations are known to produce remarkable acoustic effects in natural configurations. A deliberate construction in limestone, designed by people who understood the material well enough to fit it tightly without mortar in complete darkness, might easily have incorporated acoustic design as a feature of the space. It would fit with the ceremonial interpretation. It would fit with the indigenous traditions of these places as points of contact between worlds, spaces in which ordinary perception is altered and in which the boundary between the visible and invisible becomes thin. We are, by this point, very far from the specifics of what Earl Sutton and Clarence Webb found on a summer morning in 1922, or perhaps we are very close to it. It depends on what kind of question you are trying to answer. If the question is what specifically was in that tunnel and who specifically built it, then we are, in the absence of any physical evidence, only able to speculate. If the question is what kind of thing could that tunnel be, and what would its existence tell us about the pre-Columbian past of North America, then we have a good deal of material to work with, and the answers that material points toward are genuinely important. The story of the 1922 Ozarks tunnel is, finally, a story about the shape of what we don't know. Not the absence of knowledge, but its shape. The specific contours of the gap in the record, which tell us something important about how the gap was made. Gaps in the historical record are rarely accidents. They are products of choices, of the priorities of the institutions and individuals who control the mechanisms of documentation and preservation, of the politics of knowledge, in a society where knowledge and power are intimately linked, and of the deep human tendency to protect frameworks that serve existing interests from evidence that would require them to change. The gap in the record of pre-Columbian North American civilization is not a natural gap. It is a constructed one. It was made by specific decisions made by specific people in specific institutional contexts, many of them documented, over the course of roughly a century and a half of systematic archaeological practice in the Americas. And the existence of sites like the Ozarks Tunnel, visible at the edges of the record despite the best efforts of the system to contain them, tells us that what is inside that gap is not empty space. It is a civilization, or a series of civilizations, of enormous antiquity and sophistication that built in stone and in the dark, that organized itself across the continental river systems in ways that left traces everywhere you look carefully enough to see them, and that the descendants of its builders remember in traditions that have been called mythology for 200 years, while the evidence they describe has been covered over with rubble and limestone slurry. Earl Sutton died in 1964. Clarence Webb died in 1971, having never given a public account of what he saw in 1922. Robert Dillard's papers, including the transcription of his interview with Sutton, are in a library in Missouri that is open to researchers by appointment. Howard Gately's pamphlet is in a box that has not been catalogued digitally. The hillside is still there. The entrance is sealed. The tunnels, if they are there, are still there too. And here is what that means for the broader story of the continent, for the story of who built what and when, and for what purpose in the deep interior of North America before the Europeans arrived and rewrote the text of the land in their own language. It means that the story is not finished. It means that the evidence is accumulating, slowly and in the margins and against the institutional grain, but accumulating nonetheless, and that at some point, perhaps not in this generation but in the next or the one after, the weight of the accumulated anomalies is going to become too great for the framework to contain, and the framework is going to have to change. That is how knowledge works in the long run. not through the triumphant revelation of hidden truths, but through the slow accretion of pressure until the structure that has been holding the accepted narrative in place can no longer bear the load and gives way, and what was always there becomes suddenly, almost shockingly, visible. In the meantime, the hills of the Ozark Plateau stand in their ancient silence, and the limestone keeps its records in the way limestone has always kept records, with enormous patience and in the dark. Let us go now to a valley in the Canadian Shield, a place we have not visited yet in this account. A place where the story takes a specific and remarkable turn that connects the broad patterns we have been tracing to a set of physical features that exist in documented form and that have been studied, inadequately but genuinely, by people working at the margins of their disciplines. The valley is in the Canadian province of Ontario, in the vast stretch of Shield country north of Lake Huron. It is accessed by water, as most of the deep Shield is, by a series of lakes and portages that in the summer months are navigable by canoe and in the winter months are crossed on the ice. There is no road, there is no town. There are a handful of hunting camps that are used seasonally by local Anishinaabe families who have maintained their connection to the territory through the entire period of colonial settlement, and whose knowledge of the land in that valley is both detailed and, in significant respects, deliberately guarded. In the late 1990s, a team of freshwater biologists doing a routine lake survey in the region noticed, on the walls of a narrows between two lake sections, a series of marks that were clearly not natural. Not the red ochre paintings that are common at sites across the Shield, which are well known to biologists and campers, and are treated as the unremarkable background feature of Shield travel that they have become. Something different, something that looked like quarry marks, the marks left by the systematic extraction of blocks of stone from a cliff face, not random scarring from ice action or frost. Deliberate, geometrically regular marks, arranged in a pattern that suggested a sequence of cuts made by tools with a straight edge. The biologists were not archaeologists, but they were scientists, and they documented what they found. Their documentation included measurements and photographs and GPS coordinates. They included it as an appendix to their lake survey report, with the note that the features were of uncertain archaeological significance and should be examined by a qualified specialist. The report was filed with the provincial agency responsible for natural resources. The appendix note was followed up, after about a year, by a letter from a provincial archaeologist who said the site had been added to the provincial archaeological site inventory and that a field assessment would be conducted when resources permitted. The field assessment has not yet been conducted, as of the last inquiry that produced a public response, which was in the early 2010s. The biologists' photographs are part of the agency record and are therefore technically subject to Freedom of Information requests. One of those photographs has been seen by the researcher who is studying the petroglyphs on the nearby cliff face, the one who believes the petroglyphs constitute a navigational map. She believes the quarry marks are connected to the map. She believes, and this is the part of her argument that her few colleagues find most difficult to engage with, that the stone extracted from the cliff face in the Narrows was taken somewhere specific, that it was used in a construction that the map is directing the reader toward, and that the construction is inside the lake system rather than adjacent to it. Inside the lake system, not underneath the lake, not submerged beneath the water, but inside the system of passages and chambers within the limestone bedrock that underlies the lake, connected to the surface water through the complex hydrological network of the Shield Karst, the same kind of network, in principle, that connects the cave systems of the Ozark Plateau to the rivers and springs of southern Missouri. She has submitted 3 research proposals to her university's internal grant program. All 3 have been declined at the departmental review stage. She has applied for external research funding twice. Both applications have been declined. She continues to work with her own resources and on her own time, during the summers when she can get to the site by canoe. We mention her not because her specific hypothesis has been confirmed, it hasn't, but because her situation is representative of the situation of a significant number of researchers who are working at the edges of the conventional archaeological framework in North America and who find that the structures of institutional support are simply not available for work that challenges the foundational assumptions of the field. It is not that their evidence is examined and found wanting. It is that the evidence is not seriously examined at all, because the category of thing the evidence points toward is not one that the institutional framework has space for. This is the structural silence that the Ozarks tunnel has been sitting inside for 100 years. Not a single deliberate decision to suppress a single piece of evidence, but a system-wide incapacity to engage with evidence that does not fit the categories the system has established for itself. Now we should consider the artifact, the ceramic object, or whatever it was, that sat on the platform in the room that Earl Sutton described. We don't know what it was, we don't know where it went, but we can think about what it might have been, in the context of what we know about the material culture of the ancient interior of North America. Ceramics are one of the most durable and therefore most informative categories of archaeological material. They survive in the ground for thousands of years. Their composition reflects the clay sources available in the region where they were made, and those clay sources can, in many cases, be chemically characterized in ways that allow archaeologists to trace a ceramic object back to the general region of its production. Their form and decoration reflect the cultural traditions of the people who made them, and the variation in form and decoration across time and space is one of the primary tools archaeologists use to trace cultural change and interaction. The ceramic traditions of the eastern interior of North America are varied and complex, and go back at least 4,000 years in their earliest forms. The woodland period cultures, which preceded the Mississippian and which were active across the interior from roughly 1000 BCE to 1000 CE, produced ceramics of considerable technical sophistication, with thin walls and complex surface treatments, including incised geometric designs, stamped patterns, and in some cases figural elements. Some woodland ceramics show decorative motifs that have close parallels in the material cultures of cultures in Mesoamerica, which is one of several lines of evidence suggesting that the interior of the continent was not as isolated from the more complex civilizations to the south, as the standard narrative implies. If the object on the platform in the Ozarks room was ceramic, and if it was associated with the stonework of the room, rather than being a later intrusion, it would tell us something about the cultural context of the builders. Identifying it without physical access to it is not possible, but the placement on a central platform in a deep chamber reached only through a constructed passage system is consistent with the treatment of ceremonially significant objects in several pre-Columbian traditions, including the Hopewell culture of the Ohio Valley, which was active roughly between 100 BCE and 500 CE, and which is known for the extraordinary craftsmanship and geographic range of its ceremonial materials. The Hopewell culture is one of the most important and least adequately understood of the pre-Columbian interior civilizations. It was not an urban culture in the Mississippian sense. It did not build cities or permanent large-scale settlements. What it built was a network of ceremonial centers, earthwork complexes of geometric precision and monumental scale that were used for mortuary rituals and ceremonial exchange, connected by a trade system that brought materials from as far as the Gulf Coast, the Rocky Mountains, and the Appalachians into central Ohio for transformation into the extraordinary objects that have been found in Hopewell burial mounds. Copper from Lake Superior, obsidian from Wyoming, alligator teeth from Florida, mica from the Carolinas, grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies. The Hopewell people were not wanderers picking up curiosities. They were operating a designed system of symbolic exchange across an enormous geographic range, and the objects they made from the materials they gathered represent some of the finest craft production in the pre-Columbian Americas. Figures cut from sheets of mica with a delicacy that still impresses contemporary jewelers. Copper repoussé work, depicting human and animal forms with a technical skill and an expressive sophistication that places it in the same category as the best metalwork of any ancient culture in the world. The Hopewell system collapsed, for reasons that are still debated, somewhere around 500 CE. What happened to the people, the knowledge, the networks? The question is genuinely open. The Mississippian culture that succeeded it, several centuries later, shows significant continuities with the Hopewell tradition, but is also significantly different in scale and organization. More urban, more hierarchical, more politically centralized. Something was lost in the transition, and something was transformed. One of the things that may have persisted, not as a continuous living tradition but as a geographical fact, is the subterranean architecture. If the stone-fitted passages and chambers of the Ozarks were built during or before the Hopewell period, they would have been already centuries old by the time the Mississippian cultures rose to their peak. They might have continued to be used for purposes that evolved as the cultures using them evolved, or they might have been forgotten on the surface, while remaining physically intact underground, preserved in the dark and the cold of the limestone interior in a way that nothing on the surface survives. And they might, at some point in the 19th or early 20th century, have been found by someone who understood what they were. There is a specific and documentable tradition of interest in pre-Columbian subterranean structures among a subset of 19th century American scholars and collectors who were working in the period before American archaeology developed its institutional frameworks and professional standards. These men, and they were almost exclusively men, were part of the same intellectual milieu that produced the great natural history museums and the early anthropological societies, and they shared with those institutions an acquisitive approach to the material culture of the past. But they also shared a genuine, if poorly disciplined, curiosity about the mysteries of the American interior, and some of them documented things that their successors, once the institutional frameworks were in place, chose not to build on. Among these men, there was a loose network of correspondence centered in Louis and Cincinnati in the decades after the Civil War, and one of the recurring topics in that correspondence was what they called the underground works. Not the mounds, which were well known and widely discussed, but the other things, the things in the hills, the passages and chambers that various correspondents reported encountering in the limestone country of the Ozarks and the Upper Ohio Valley and the Cumberland Plateau. The correspondence was collected by one of the participants, a Louis businessman named Aldrich Pennington, who was an amateur archaeologist of genuine enthusiasm and limited method. Pennington's collection passed to a nephew, and eventually to a library in Louis, where it was catalogued in the 1920s and has remained accessible, though not widely accessed, ever since. In Pennington's collection, there are references to at least 7 distinct locations at which correspondents reported finding subterranean stone construction in the decades between 1865 and 1895. None of these reports are presented as significant. They are mentioned in the same tone as reports of unusual weather or good hunting, as curiosities of the local landscape. In some cases, the correspondents say they have heard about the structures from local residents who treat them as unremarkable features of the terrain. In one case, a correspondent says he entered a passage for about 30 feet and found it too dark to continue. In another case, the correspondent says the local people say the passages go a long way and connect to other passages, but nobody he asked would go in them. The geographic distribution of these reports, when mapped, shows a concentration in the Ozark Plateau and the immediately surrounding limestone hill country, with outliers in the Cumberland Plateau of Tennessee and Kentucky, and one report from the limestone country of the northern Ohio Valley. This distribution follows, as we have noted, the ancient river corridors and the karst geology of the eastern interior. It is not random. It is the distribution you would expect if you were mapping a genuine cultural phenomenon that was tied to a specific geological environment and that extended along the natural communication routes of the pre-Columbian interior. None of this has been followed up systematically. The Pennington collection has been cited in the literature of Ozark folklore, but not in the archaeological literature. The reports it contains have been treated as curiosities rather than as evidence, and the sites themselves, to the extent they can be identified from the often imprecise geographic descriptions in the letters, have in most cases not been investigated. We are now going to turn to a question that this entire story has been circling around without addressing directly. Why does it matter? Not just academically, not just as a historical puzzle, but in terms of its consequences for the way we understand the present. The story of pre-Columbian North America, the story we tell about who was here and what they did, and how complex their civilizations were, and how far their networks extended, is not just a historical story. It is a story with active political consequences. It informs the legal frameworks within which indigenous land claims are adjudicated. It shapes the cultural narratives within which indigenous communities understand themselves and within which the broader public understands them. It determines what counts as evidence and who gets to be a witness. And it has, for the past 200 years, been told in a way that systematically underestimates the antiquity, the sophistication, and the geographic extent of pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas. The consequences of that underestimation have been enormous. When you tell a story in which the pre-Columbian Americas were a largely empty land occupied by simple peoples with limited organizational capacity and no tradition of monumental or architectural construction, you create a narrative in which the colonization of that land is, if not exactly justified, at least rendered as something other than the destruction of an ancient and sophisticated civilization. You make it possible to describe what happened as development rather than as conquest, as settlement rather than as dispossession. The alternative story, the story that the tunnels and the copper and the Poverty Point earthworks and the Hopewell network and the Lake Superior quarry marks and the petroglyphs and the oral traditions and the testimony of two boys in 1922 all point toward, is a story of a continent that was fully inhabited by cultures of extraordinary depth and sophistication, cultures that built in stone and in the dark and in the light, that organized themselves across continental scales, that maintained traditions of knowledge and ceremony across thousands of years, and that were, when the Europeans arrived, in the midst of their own long and complex history that was not about to reach an ending. That story is politically inconvenient. It complicates the ownership of the land in ways that the legal and political frameworks built on the simple story are not designed to manage. It requires a rethinking of the relationship between the institutional structures of North American scholarship and the communities whose ancestors produced the record those institutions claim the right to interpret. And it requires, most fundamentally, a willingness to acknowledge that the framework within which American archaeology has operated for its entire existence as a professional discipline was built in part to serve the interests of a colonial system, rather than to honestly document the human past. This is a difficult set of things to sit with. It is uncomfortable in the way that genuine historical honesty tends to be uncomfortable, but it is, we think, what the evidence points toward, and it is where the story of the 1922 Ozarks tunnel ultimately leads, if you follow it far enough. The tunnel is a door, not in the literal sense, though it is that too, in the sense that every genuine anomaly in the historical record is a door, a point of entry into a larger room than the one you are standing in, a passage that leads, if you are willing to follow it, to a view of the past that is richer and stranger and more deeply human than the simplified version you started with. Earl Sutton followed a draft of air through a gap in a hillside and found a room with a platform and something on it that he couldn't quite see in the candlelight. The door is still there. The passage is still there. The room, if it is still intact beneath the rubble and the limestone slurry, is waiting in the dark. So let us keep following the draft. There is a dimension of this story we have not yet fully explored, and that is the question of the builder's understanding of the landscape itself, not as a resource or a territory, but as a text. This is a way of relating to land that is difficult for the modern Western mind to access, because it requires a different relationship to time and to the non-human world than the one most of us have been trained into, but it is not an exotic or mystical concept. It is a practical epistemology, a way of knowing that encodes information about the behavior of water and rock and living systems over long time periods, in forms that can be passed between generations, and that can be acted upon in ways that have real material consequences. The karst landscape of the Ozark Plateau is a system that rewards exactly this kind of knowing. The water that moves through the limestone, carving passages and chambers and resurfacing as springs miles from where it went underground, follows rules that are consistent and learnable, but that require generations of observation to fully understand. A community that has been living in close relationship with a particular stretch of karst landscape for dozens or hundreds of generations develops a knowledge of its water systems, its underground passages, its seasonal behaviors, and its long-term patterns that no external survey, however sophisticated its technology, can replicate from scratch. The people who built the subterranean structures of the Ozarks, whoever they were, had that knowledge. They knew where to build because they knew where the dry passages were, the ones that did not flood seasonally, the ones where the air circulated rather than stagnated, the ones where the ceiling was stable and the floor was solid. They knew how to work the limestone without tools that left obvious evidence of their presence, which suggests either that they worked with stone-on-stone techniques refined to an extraordinary degree of precision, or that they had access to tool technologies that we have not found in the archaeological record of the region, and they knew, or at least it seems they knew, how to build for permanence, how to fit stone in ways that would resist the movement of the earth and the erosion of the water over centuries and possibly millennia. This is a level of geological and architectural knowledge that does not develop in a generation or a decade. It is the product of a long tradition of engagement with a specific kind of landscape, transmitted across many generations through a combination of direct instruction and accumulated practice, exactly the kind of deep traditional knowledge that the indigenous peoples of the region have maintained, in fragmentary form, through the entire period of colonial disruption. Which brings us to something that deserves more attention than it usually receives in discussions of this kind: the question of continuity. The standard narrative of pre-Columbian North America tends to treat the various cultural periods, archaic, woodland, Mississippian, as relatively distinct entities separated by gaps of unknown character. The cultures come and go, the populations shift, the traditions change. But the people themselves, the biological human beings who inhabited the landscape across all of these periods, did not come and go in the same way. They persisted, they adapted, they maintained connections to their landscapes and to each other across the transitions between one named cultural period and the next. The descendants of the builders of the Ozarks tunnels, if those tunnels were built by people who were ancestral to any of the named pre-Columbian cultures of the region, are here. They are living in communities in Missouri and Arkansas and Oklahoma and Kansas, having survived the removals and the assimilation campaigns and the disruptions of 2 centuries of colonialism, with their cultural connections to their landscapes damaged but not destroyed. And some of what they carry in their traditions is relevant to the question of what the hills contain. We have touched on this earlier, with the Osage tradition of the places beneath the ground and the Cherokee concept of the long house beneath the surface. But the specific content of those traditions, the detailed geographical and architectural knowledge they might contain about specific sites, is not available to this account, because it has not been made available publicly, and there are very good reasons for that. The traditions are not available because the communities that hold them have learned, through hard experience, that making their knowledge available to outsiders tends not to benefit them. The knowledge gets extracted and published and attributed to academic researchers and used in ways that serve the extractors rather than the communities from which it came. It gets commodified, it gets turned into entertainment, it gets used to establish academic careers while the communities themselves receive nothing. This is not paranoia. It is documented history, repeated across the entire relationship between Western academia and indigenous knowledge systems in North America. And it means that the single most important source of detailed local knowledge about what is beneath the Ozark Hills is, for entirely understandable reasons, not accessible to this inquiry. What we can say is this: the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Ozark region and the Great Lakes corridor consistently describe a subterranean world that is real, that was built, and that connects to the surface world at specific points that the traditions often locate with some geographical precision. That description is consistent with the physical evidence from the sites that have been documented, and the consistency between the oral traditions and the physical evidence across cultures that did not share languages and that had, at the time of European contact, been separated by colonial disruption for varying lengths of time, is the kind of independent corroboration that, in any other context, would be treated as significant evidential support for the hypothesis that the traditions are describing something real. That it has not been treated as such is a reflection of the specific ways in which the Academy has historically managed the relationship between indigenous knowledge and Western scientific frameworks, treating indigenous testimony as folklore in need of Western validation rather than as primary evidence in its own right. That management is changing, slowly, as indigenous scholars take their place in the academic conversation and as the field of archaeology begins, reluctantly, to acknowledge the implications of its own history of bias. But it is changing slowly enough that the practical consequences for the investigation of sites like the Ozarks Tunnel are still largely negative. Let us think now about water, about what water knows and what it carries and what it leaves behind. The relationship between water and stone in the Ozark Karst is one of the most intimate and most violent relationships in the natural world. Over millions of years, slightly acidic water moving through the limestone bedrock has dissolved passages and chambers of extraordinary complexity, a three-dimensional labyrinth of connected spaces ranging from narrow fissures through which the water barely moves to vast caverns where entire river systems flow in the dark. The landscape above this labyrinth is the surface expression of what is happening beneath it, the sinkholes and springs and losing streams. The places where water enters the ground and the places where it emerges are the visible evidence of a system whose true extent is largely unknown. Into this system, at some point in the pre-Columbian past, people built. They built in the existing spaces, modifying them for human use, and they may in some cases have created new spaces by extending natural passages through deliberate quarrying. The question of extent, of how large and how connected the system of constructed passages actually is answerable only through systematic exploration that has never been authorized or attempted. What water has done to that system in the intervening centuries is one of the most important unknown variables. Passages that were dry when they were built may have flooded. Sections of ceiling may have collapsed. The connections between individual chambers may have been opened or closed by the movement of the water table, as climate has changed over centuries and millennia. The system that Earl Sutton entered in 1922 may be significantly different from whatever existed at its time of construction, and it may be significantly different today from what he found. But limestone is also extraordinarily durable. The fitted stonework in a dry passage, protected from the movement of water by the geometry of the local hydrology, could remain intact indefinitely. The room Sutton described, if it was built in a stable part of the karst above the active water table, might be exactly as he left it. The platform might still be there. Whatever was on the platform, whatever the man in the city suit chose to remove in 1922, might have left traces that could tell us something about what it was, if anyone ever goes back. The hillside is still there. The rubble fill at the entrance is not permanent. It could be removed. Whether it ever will be is a different question, and the answer to that question depends not on the physical condition of the site, but on the political and institutional conditions of the world in which the investigation would have to occur. The land belongs to someone. The relevant governmental agencies have jurisdiction over archaeological investigation within their territories. The indigenous communities with cultural connections to the site have rights that are increasingly recognized in both legal and ethical frameworks. Any serious investigation would require the cooperation of all of these parties, and getting that cooperation is a process that looks very different today than it did in 1922, and that is governed by frameworks of consultation and consent that were not present when the man in the city suit arrived with his expense report and his wrapped object. Whether that is good or bad depends on what you think the goal is. If the goal is to extract and publish knowledge as quickly as possible, the current framework is a significant obstacle. If the goal is to ensure that any knowledge produced from an investigation of this site serves the communities with the deepest historical connection to it, rather than external institutions with their own agendas. The current framework is an improvement on what existed before, though it is still far from adequate. What we can say with confidence is that the question is not resolved and that the evidence is not exhausted. The story of the 1922 Ozarks tunnel is open, in the technical sense that the site is physically intact and the investigation has not been completed and the relevant evidence has not been fully gathered and assessed. It is the kind of open story that the history of human knowledge is full of. Stories where the evidence has outrun the frameworks available to make sense of it, and where the frameworks are taking a very long time to catch up. We find ourselves, as we have been tracing the threads of this story, in the company of a recurring cast of characters. The methodical amateur, working outside institutional structures with his own resources and his own time, driven by a genuine curiosity that the professional gatekeepers have declined to exercise. The indigenous community member who knows more than they are telling, and who has good reasons for not telling it. The institutional bureaucrat whose job is to manage a framework rather than to question it. The young witness whose account is taken seriously by no one at the time, and who spends the rest of their life knowing what they saw without any external validation of what it means. And the physical site itself, the hillside, the sealed entrance, the constructed spaces in the dark, waiting with the patience of stone for someone to ask the right question with the right combination of access and authority and will. These characters are not unique to this story. They appear in the history of every significant archaeological discovery that challenged the existing framework. They appear in the story of Schliemann digging at Troy when the classical scholars said Troy was a myth. They appear in the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, found by a shepherd boy and nearly lost in the gap between his discovery and the scholar's recognition of its significance. They appear in the story of the Antikythera mechanism, sitting in a museum storage room for decades before anyone understood what it was. In every case, the existing framework initially failed the evidence, and the evidence eventually forced the framework to change, though never as quickly or as completely as the evidence warranted. The pre-Columbian story of North America will eventually be told more completely and more honestly than it has been. The evidence is there. The pressure is accumulating. The researchers working at the margins are doing the groundwork that future mainstream scholars will build on. And at some point, the door in the hillside will be opened again, and someone will go back in with better lights and better tools and a better framework for understanding what they find. And the room will be there, or something will be there that tells us about what was there, and the interpretation of what it means will be shaped by the state of our understanding at that future moment, by how much we have been willing to acknowledge between now and then about the complexity and antiquity of the human past in this part of the world. What we can do now is follow the evidence as carefully as we can, and hold the questions as honestly as we can, and resist the temptation of both the simple dismissal and the grand unified theory, both of which are ways of closing the door rather than going through it. The door, as we keep saying, is still there. Let us close this part of the story by returning to where we began, to the specific landscape of the southern Ozarks, to the specific hillside, to the specific morning in 1922 when two boys went where no one thought to look. It is difficult to reconstruct the experience of that morning from Earl Sutton's words, in a transcription of a conversation recorded on wire and later typed on a machine whose ribbon needed changing. The texture is thin, the sensory detail is minimal, but there are moments in the 11-page document where something of the experience comes through, moments where the language sharpens and the distance collapses a little, and you feel the presence of the boy who grew into the old man who sat in the rest home and told Robert Dillard what he remembered. One of those moments is when Sutton describes first noticing the transition from natural cave to constructed passage. He says he put his hand on the wall and it was different. He says he stopped and made Clarence stop too and held the candle up close to the wall. He says he ran his fingers along the joint between two stones, and he could feel that it was a joint, that the stones had been placed against each other with intention. He says he knew in that moment that something was wrong with the world in the way that nothing was wrong with the world, that everything was fine and ordinary and exactly as it had always been, except that there was this wall in this hillside that someone had put there, and the someone was not anyone he had ever known about. That moment, the moment of recognition, is one of the most fundamental human experiences. The recognition that the world contains something you did not know it contained, something that does not fit the map, something that has been there all along waiting for you to find it, and that changes, in its finding, the scale of the map you are carrying. That experience is what this entire story is about. Not the cover-up, which is real but secondary. Not the grand implications for the history of the continent, which are real but abstract. The moment of touching the wall in the dark and knowing that a stone had been placed there by someone who understood something you don't. Earl Sutton spent the rest of his life trying to explain that moment to people who had not had it. He did not stop believing in what he had felt. He did not revise his account to make it more acceptable. He died believing he had found something real in a hillside in 1922, and that no one had done anything serious about it in his lifetime. He was right on both counts. The wall is still there, the joint between the stones is still there. In the dark, beneath the rubble and the limestone slurry and the 75 years of silence since Dillard's wire recorder turned for the last time in a rest home in Springfield, the craftsmanship of whoever put those stones together is still intact, preserved in the cold and the dark against the day when someone will come back with a candle or something better and feel it again for the first time. There are many such walls in many such hillsides across the eastern interior of North America. The map that would show them all, if such a map existed and if it were drawn from all the available evidence rather than from the officially recognized record, would reveal a continent that is different from the one that has been described to us. Fuller, older, more deeply inhabited, more architecturally complex, more connected across its vast geography by routes of movement and exchange that the standard narrative has not acknowledged. We do not have that map. We have fragments. We have the Pennington correspondence and the Dillard transcription and the Gately pamphlet and the biologist's photographs and the researcher's journal articles and the oral traditions of the people whose ancestors made what these documents are about. We have a geological framework that makes the existence of subterranean stone construction not only possible but almost inevitable in the right landscape conditions. We have a political and institutional history that explains why the evidence has been managed the way it has been managed. And we have the testimony of a 14-year-old boy, preserved imperfectly across 40 years and a wire recording and a typewriter ribbon, who touched a wall in the dark and knew it for what it was. That is enough to follow. That is more than enough. The Ozark Hills are patient. They have been standing for a very long time. They will be standing when this account is forgotten, and when the questions it raises have been asked again by someone else, who stumbled on the same fragments of evidence from a different direction. And in the limestone, in the dark, in the carefully fitted joints of a wall that no official record has ever described, the answer is waiting for whoever has the courage and the resources and the authorization to go and get it. We have been moving through a great deal of territory in this account, and it is worth pausing to take stock of where we are and what we have been building toward, because the story of the 1,922 Ozarks Tunnel is not only a local story and not only an archaeological mystery. It is a window into a set of questions about the nature of knowledge itself, about how we decide what is true, about who gets to make that decision, and about the consequences when the decision-making process is contaminated by interests that have nothing to do with the honest pursuit of understanding. The history of Western scholarship in the Americas is, in its deepest structure, a history of contested knowledge. What counts as evidence? Whose testimony is credible? What frameworks are available for interpreting physical remains? These questions have been answered differently at different times and by different parties with different interests, and the answers have had enormous consequences for the people whose history is being described. When the academic framework says that the pre-Columbian peoples of the interior of North America were simple hunter-gatherers with limited capacity for organized construction, that answer shapes the legal and political landscape in which those people's descendants live. When the evidence of Poverty Point and Cahokia and the old copper culture and the Hopewell network forces the framework to revise that answer, The revision has implications that extend far beyond the academic literature. We are in the middle of that revision. It is not complete. It is not moving as fast as the evidence warrants, but it is happening, driven by the accumulation of anomalies that the existing framework cannot absorb, and by the growing presence of indigenous scholars in the academic conversation who bring different frameworks and different relationships to the evidence, and who are, in many cases, the most rigorous critics of the simplifications that the mainstream framework has relied on. The story of the Ozarks Tunnel is one small piece of that revision. It is not the most important piece. It is not the most dramatically evidenced piece. It is, in some ways, the most vulnerable piece, the one most easily dismissed as folklore, as the product of two excited boys and a network of confirmation-seeking researchers. But it is also, in its very vulnerability, one of the most honest pieces, the one that most clearly shows the texture of the problem, the way genuine evidence and institutional resistance interact at the level of the specific and the local. Two boys, a hillside, a morning in 1922, a draft of air that tasted like a place that had never been touched. Everything else, all the copper and the earthworks and the petroglyphs and the oral traditions and the suppressed reports and the unanswered research proposals and the biologists' photographs and the researchers' journal articles and the man in the city suit and his wrapped object, all of it radiates outward. From that one moment of contact between a 14-year-old's candle and a stone wall that someone had placed in the dark. The draft is still moving, follow it. Now here, as this long story begins to settle, we should say something about what the land itself remembers, because this is the dimension of the story that tends to get lost in the focus on institutions and frameworks and political consequences, but that may in the end be the most important. The Ozark Plateau is one of the places on the North American continent where the land has the deepest and most uninterrupted relationship with human presence. People have been walking its ridges and paddling its rivers and sheltering in its bluffs for longer than most of the world's named civilizations have existed. In that time, the land has been shaped by their presence, and they have been shaped by it, in a mutual process that is not over and has not been over at any point in the record we can access. The springs that emerge from the limestone in the Ozarks are ancient. Some of them have been flowing continuously for longer than the first known human presence in the region. They emerge cold and clear from passages that connect them to the water table of the broader karst system, and that water table connects them in turn to every part of the landscape above it, to every rain and every flood and every drought that has moved through the region in the past however many thousands of years. The springs carry in their water a kind of memory of the landscape, a chemical record of what has passed through the limestone above them, and that record, in principle, could be read by anyone with the right tools and the right questions. The stones in the wall of the passage that Earl Sutton touched also carry a record. Every stone carries a record of its geological history, of the conditions under which it was formed and the processes it has undergone since. And limestone carries, in addition, the record of anything that has grown on it or adhered to it since it was quarried. Calcite formations that accumulate at known rates, and that can, in principle, be dated by uranium series methods to give a minimum age for the exposure of the stone surface. If the walls of the Ozarks Passage are ever accessible for systematic sampling, the stones themselves will be able to say something about how old they are, about how long they have been in their current configuration, and about what has happened to them since they were placed. The land remembers, stone remembers, water remembers. The question is whether we are willing to ask them what they know. And we are getting close now to the end of this account, not because the story is over, it isn't, it's open in all the ways we have described, but because we have followed the evidence as far as it will take us from this distance and with the tools available to us. We have traced the specific account of 1922 through its context and its parallels and its implications and its politics, and we have arrived at a place where the known and the unknown are in a specific and productive relationship with each other, where the gaps in the record are legible enough to be meaningful, and the evidence is robust enough to point in a direction, even if it cannot yet tell us what we will find when we get there. What we will find, we believe, or rather what someone with the access and the authorization and the will to look will find, is evidence of a pre-Columbian tradition of subterranean stone construction in the eastern interior of North America that is significantly older and more geographically extensive than anything in the current mainstream archaeological record. We believe this because the fragments of evidence point consistently in that direction, and because the mechanisms by which the evidence has been managed are themselves evidence that something was there to manage. You don't fill in an entrance to a root cellar with an out-of-county work crew supervised by a man from the Bureau of Ethnology. You fill in a root cellar with a shovel. The scale of the response tells you something about the scale of what was being responded to. We believe, additionally, that this tradition of construction is connected in ways that have not yet been fully mapped to the broader network of pre-Columbian activity in the interior, to the copper extraction and the trade networks and the earthwork complexes and the astronomical knowledge and the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples who have maintained their connection to this landscape across the entire period of colonial disruption. We believe this because the pattern of the evidence, taken as a whole, is too consistent to be coincidental and too widespread to be explained by any model that treats the various anomalies as isolated curiosities. And we believe that the political and institutional obstacles to investigating this tradition honestly, while real and significant, are not permanent. They are products of a specific historical moment that is passing, slowly but passing. The pressures for revision are real. The resources for investigation are growing. The frameworks for doing the work in a way that respects the communities whose history is at stake are developing, and the anomalies are not going away. They keep being found. They keep being documented by people who do not fit the pattern the system expects, and who therefore cannot be managed the way it expects to manage them. The biologists with their lake survey, the boys with their candles, the insurance adjuster with his pamphlet, the geologist who spent his entire career studying rock formations and knew, quietly and privately, that what he had seen was not what the categories said it could be. The draft of air that moves through the passage in the hillside does not know about any of this. It moves because the pressure differential between the cave system and the outside atmosphere requires it to move. It has been moving since before anyone put those stones in the wall. It moved through the dark while the wall was being built. It moved through the dark while the room was being used for whatever it was used for. It moved through the centuries of silence after the builders were gone and before the boys arrived with their candles. It moved past their faces when they stood in the entrance and felt it for the first time. It moved through the rubble fill after the entrance was sealed, finding its way out through the interstices of the limestone, dispersing into the thin, cold air of the Ozark morning. It is still moving. Follow it. You have been listening to a story about what the ground contains, about the long patience of stone and water, and the shorter impatience of human curiosity, trying to make sense of a world that is older and stranger than the frameworks we have built to contain it. The story is not finished. The tunnels are not empty. The records in the small archives and the oral traditions of the communities with the deepest connection to this landscape have not been fully read. The investigations that would answer the most important questions have not yet been authorized, but the evidence is there, and the questions are there, and the land is there, waiting with the patience of an entity that has been keeping its records in stone and water for a great deal longer than we have been asking it questions. If you have made it this far, you have followed this account through a great many rooms and passages, through the institutional history of American archaeology, and the political history of North American colonialism, and the geological reality of the Ozark Karst, and the oral traditions of the peoples who have always known what the hills contain. You have followed it because, we think, you already understood that the standard version of the story was too small, that it left things out, that the official record and the full record were not the same thing. You were right. They are not the same thing. The full record is still being assembled. The passage is still there. The room is still there, in the dark, in the cold, in the silence of a limestone hill in the southern Ozarks that has been standing since before anyone thought to give it a name. And somewhere in that room, or in what remains of it, or in the traces left by whatever was carried out of it in a man's coat on a summer afternoon in 1922, is a piece of the answer to the question that this story has been asking all along. Who was here? What did they know? What did they build? We are still finding out. The draft moves. The stones hold. The water, somewhere beneath us, finds its way. Rest now. The hills are patient. The answers will come in their own time, the way things always come when they belong to the deep past. Slowly from the dark, and more complete than we expected. We should talk about the river, the specific river that runs through the valley below the hillside where Earl Sutton and Clarence Webb made their discovery. Because rivers in the Ozarks are not just rivers in the ordinary sense. They are not simply channels through which water moves from one place to another, though they are that too. They are, in the specific geological and cultural context of the Ozark Plateau, archives. They carry sediment from every part of the watershed above them. They cut through the geological record wherever they encounter bedrock. And, in the bends and the bluffs along their courses, they expose, to anyone willing to look closely, cross-sections of the landscape history that no surface survey could provide. The river near the Sutton property in 1922 was the kind of river that Ozark residents know as a spring river, fed not primarily by surface runoff but by the springs that emerge from the limestone at intervals along its course, keeping it cold and clear even in the drier summers. Spring rivers are remarkable features of the karst landscape, and the reason they matter to this story is that the water that feeds them comes from the same underground system that contains whatever passages and chambers the builders of the Ozark tunnels made their structures in. The springs are the exhaust vents of the karst. They are the places where the pressure of the underground water table finds its way out, and they have been flowing, many of them, without interruption since the end of the last glaciation, and in some cases much longer. Early European explorers of the Ozark region made note of these springs with a consistency that tells you something about their significance. Not just that they noticed them, but that they noted their size, their clarity, their temperature, and very often the tradition among the indigenous people they encountered of regarding the springs as sacred sites, as places of special power and significance that were associated with ceremony and with the invisible world. The springs at the mouths of caves, especially, were noted as sites of specific cultural significance, places where the underground and the surface worlds made contact, and where that contact was marked by human activity ranging from simple offering to complex ceremony. The spring that supplied the creek on the Sutton property was not, as far as we know, one of the large springs that have been formally documented as archaeological sites. But it was a spring, and it emerged from the limestone of the same hillside system that contained the tunnel. The relationship between the spring and the tunnel, if there is one, is not established. But the hydrology of the karst suggests that they were connected to the same underground water system, and that the people who built the tunnel knew about the spring, and may have incorporated it into whatever understanding of the landscape they were working with. This is not a trivial point. One of the things that distinguishes the pre-Columbian cultures of the eastern interior from the simple model of isolated hunter-gatherer bands is the evidence of systematic engagement with the landscape at a level that presupposes not just observation but understanding, not just familiarity but knowledge of mechanisms, of how things work over time, of what the landscape is doing beneath its surface. The siting of major ceremonial centers in the pre-Columbian interior was not random. Cahokia sits at the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi, at the center of the richest agricultural land in the interior, and at the crossroads of the major river trade routes. Poverty Point sits on a bluff above the Mississippi floodplain, at a point where the river dynamics create a natural concentration of resources. The Hopewell earthwork centers in Ohio sit in the valleys of rivers that drain the most productive agricultural land in the Great Lakes watershed. These were not accidents of geography. These were choices made by people who understood the landscape at a level of sophistication that their contemporary European equivalents, still several centuries away from the scientific revolution, could not have matched. The builders of the Ozark tunnels made their own choices about where to build, choices that reflect an intimate knowledge of the karst hydrology and the geology of the limestone, and those choices are themselves evidence of a cultural tradition of landscape understanding that goes back further than any of the named cultures of the mainstream record. We have been moving around a specific historical period without naming it directly. Let us name it now. There is a period in the pre-Columbian interior of North America, running roughly from 3,000 to 8,000 years before present, that archaeologists call the Archaic period, a name that is both descriptive and subtly dismissive, implying a kind of foundational simplicity that the evidence, when examined carefully, does not support. The Archaic is the period between the Paleo-Indian cultures of the Great Ice Age megafauna hunters and the woodland cultures that immediately preceded the Mississippian. It is a long period, 5,000 years, longer than the entirety of recorded Western history, and it is during this period that the most significant and least understood developments in the human history of the interior took place. The Old Copper culture, which we have already mentioned in the context of the Lake Superior copper extraction, is an archaic phenomenon. It flourished roughly between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, and it produced copper tools and ornaments of extraordinary technical sophistication, objects that represent the first metallurgical tradition in North American history, and that predate by centuries any comparable tradition in Mesoamerica or the Andes. The people of the Old Copper culture were not simple hunter-gatherers in any meaningful sense of that term. They were miners, metallurgists, long-distance traders, and organizers of collective labor, and they occupied a geographic territory that encompassed the Great Lakes Basin and extended, through their trade networks, across much of the eastern interior. The connection between the Old Copper culture and the subterranean construction tradition of the Ozarks is speculative but not unreasonable. The geographic overlap is real. The Ozarks lie at the southern edge of the Old Copper culture known distribution, and the river systems that connected the Ozark Plateau to the Great Lakes Basin were the same river systems along which old copper artifacts have been found. If the builders of the Ozark tunnels were active during the Archaic period, they were contemporaneous with the Old Copper culture and potentially connected to it by the same networks of movement and exchange that distributed copper artifacts across the interior. This would place the construction of the Ozark tunnels, tentatively and speculatively, in a period roughly 3,000 to 8,000 years ago. That is an enormous span of time, and the placement within it depends on physical dating evidence that we do not have because the sites have not been systematically investigated. But it is consistent with the geological observations at the Arkansas site, where the calcite formations overlying the fitted stonework suggest a very long interval of undisturbed accumulation, and it is consistent with the depth of the oral traditions associated with the sites, which in several indigenous frameworks describe the builders as belonging to a time so remote that ordinary genealogical memory does not reach them. The age is not the most important thing. The existence is. And the existence points toward a pre-Columbian North America that, in its archaic manifestation, was doing things that the standard model does not account for, and has largely chosen not to investigate. Let us spend some time now with the Great Lakes, because the story of the Great Lakes in the pre-Columbian period is itself one of the most underappreciated dimensions of the continental story, and it connects directly to the Ozarks narrative through the river systems and the copper and the tradition of subterranean construction that we have been tracing. The Great Lakes are the largest system of freshwater lakes in the world. They contain roughly 18% of the world fresh surface water. Their drainage basin encompasses an enormous area of the continent, and the river systems that flow from them and into them connect the interior of the continent to the Atlantic coast through the Street, Lawrence system, and to the Gulf of Mexico through the Mississippi system. In the pre-Columbian period, before the artificial barriers of dams and industrial development reshaped the hydrology of the interior, the Great Lakes were the hub of a continental water network that made possible a degree of communication and exchange across the interior that is only just beginning to be appreciated. The archaeology of the Great Lakes Basin is, in proportion to its significance, relatively poorly known. This is partly a matter of access. Much of the relevant archaeology lies beneath water, either the lakes themselves, which have risen and fallen significantly over the post-glacial period and have submerged shorelines and settlements that were occupied in earlier periods, or the rivers that drain the basin, whose sediments have buried the evidence of occupation along their banks under depths of alluvium that are expensive and technically demanding to investigate. But it is also, in part, a matter of institutional priorities. The Great Lakes region, straddling the border between the United States and Canada, falls under two separate national archaeological frameworks that do not always communicate effectively with each other, and the indigenous peoples of the region, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and other nations who have maintained their connections to the lakes for generations, have had complex and not always productive relationships with the institutions conducting the research. What is known, from the evidence that has been excavated and documented, is remarkable. The Great Lakes Basin was densely occupied during the Archaic period by cultures that were not simple foragers but sophisticated land and water managers with deep knowledge of the lake ecosystems and their seasonal dynamics. The Laurentian Archaic culture, active from roughly 5,000 to 3,000 years ago in the eastern Great Lakes and the Street, Lawrence Valley, produced copper tools and ornaments that show a relationship to the old copper culture of the western Great Lakes, suggesting communication and exchange across the entire basin. The Point Peninsula culture of the Middle Great Lakes, slightly later in time, produced ceramic traditions that show connections to both the Great Lakes Basin and the broader woodland traditions of the interior. And beneath the surface of Lake Huron, in the specific stretch of underwater terrain that was exposed as dry land during a low stand of the Great Lakes level approximately 9,000 years ago, there is a stone feature that has been documented by underwater archaeological surveys and that has no obvious explanation within the standard model of the pre-Columbian Great Lakes. It is a structure, a linear arrangement of stone that runs for a significant distance along what would have been, 9,000 years ago, a ridge overlooking a lake crossing route. The structure is not natural. It is too regular, too consistent in its construction to be the product of geological processes. It appears to have been built by people on the dry shore of a lake that was 9,000 years ago at a level significantly lower than today, in a landscape that is now 50 feet under the surface of Lake Huron. The dating is robust. The geological context is well understood. The people who built the structure were, by the chronology, among the earliest inhabitants of the Great Lakes region after the ice sheets retreated. They were building, 9,000 years ago, a stone structure on the shore of an ancient lake in what is now the middle of Lake Huron. This fact is in the published literature. It has been reported in peer-reviewed journals. It is real. And it is, like everything else in this story, not fully integrated into the standard model of pre-Columbian North American development, because the standard model has no place for stone construction of this antiquity in this region. The underwater feature at Lake Huron and the subterranean stonework of the Ozarks are connected by more than just their anomalous status relative to the standard model. They are connected geographically, through the river systems of the interior, and temporally, through the broad span of the Archaic period during which both features may have been produced. They are connected culturally, through the evidence of the old copper culture and the archaic trade networks that distributed material culture across the entire eastern interior. And they are connected structurally, in the sense that both represent examples of stone construction in locations, one underwater and one underground, where the standard model says stone construction should not exist. The accumulation of these anomalies is what makes the individual cases, each of which is individually dismissible as an isolated curiosity, collectively significant. You can dismiss the Ozarks Tunnel as a misidentified natural formation or an exaggerated folk memory. You can dismiss the Lake Huron underwater structure as an unusual geological feature whose artificiality has been overstated. You can dismiss Poverty Point as an exceptional outlier that does not challenge the overall framework. You can dismiss the old copper culture missing copper as a statistical artifact of inadequate sampling. You can manage each anomaly individually, as the institutional systems have been doing for a century. But the accumulation of managed anomalies becomes, at some point, more revealing than any single unmanaged one. The shape of the coverage, the pattern of what has been systematically minimized, tells you something about the shape of what is being covered. Now let us turn to something that has been waiting in the background of this entire account, something that gives the specific anomalies we have been discussing their deepest context and their most challenging implication. Let us talk about what the ancient peoples of the interior knew about the sky. Archaeoastronomy is one of the most contentious fields in the study of pre-Columbian North America, not because the evidence for astronomical knowledge in ancient American cultures is weak. It is in many respects overwhelming, but because engaging with it seriously requires acknowledging a level of mathematical and observational sophistication in pre-Columbian cultures that the standard model is reluctant to grant them. The evidence from the southwest, from Chaco Canyon, and from the Hohokam solar markers of the Sonoran Desert, and from the astronomical alignments at Casas Grandes, has been accepted, however reluctantly, into the mainstream literature. The evidence from the eastern interior is less well accepted, partly because it is more fragmentary and partly because the institutional focus of Eastern North American archaeology has been on the mound traditions rather than on the sky traditions. But it is there, and it is compelling. The geometric earthworks of the Hopewell culture in the Ohio Valley are the most extensively studied examples of astronomical alignment in the eastern interior. The Newark earthworks, a complex of geometric enclosures whose outer boundary covers more than 4 square miles, and whose individual elements are connected by broad avenues running across the landscape, have been shown to encode the 18.6-year cycle of the lunar standstill, the point in the lunar cycle at which the moon rises and sets at its most extreme positions on the horizon. The alignment is not approximate. It is precise to a degree that implies careful, systematic observation over multiple lunar cycles, which means a minimum of 19 years of dedicated observation by people who understood what they were looking for and kept records of what they found. 19 years of careful astronomical observation and record-keeping is not the behavior of simple hunter-gatherers. It is the behavior of a culture with institutions capable of maintaining long-term projects across the span of individual human lifetimes, with mechanisms for transmitting observational records from one generation to the next, and with a conceptual framework that understood the significance of the lunar standstill and its relationship to the structure of time and the calendar. The Hopewell people had all of these things. Their earthwork complexes, distributed across the Ohio Valley and connected by geometric avenues to each other and to the broader landscape, represent an investment of collective labor and organizational capacity that implies a social complexity far beyond what the standard model attributes to pre-Mississippian cultures. And the astronomical sophistication encoded in the geometry of those complexes implies a tradition of sky-watching and record-keeping that, if it extended beyond the Hopewell period into the earlier Archaic, would provide a cultural context for the subterranean construction of the Ozarks that goes beyond simple ceremony into something more structured and more systematic. The orientation of subterranean chambers to astronomical events is documented at megalithic sites around the world. The most famous example is Newgrange in Ireland, where the winter solstice sunrise illuminates the inner chamber of the passage grave through a precisely engineered light box above the entrance. The chamber itself is constructed to focus the light at that single moment in a way that is geometrically specific and architecturally deliberate. The people who built Newgrange, roughly 5,000 years ago, understood the geometry of the solar year well enough to engineer a stone structure that would capture a specific astronomical event with a precision that impresses modern architects. Did the builders of the Ozarks Passage orient their structure to astronomical events? We do not know. Earl Sutton did not observe the orientation of the passage relative to the outside landscape, or if he did not report it in the surviving account. The sealed entrance makes any subsequent assessment of the structure orientation impossible without reopening the site. But the possibility is worth holding, because if the subterranean builders of the Ozarks shared the sky-watching tradition that is evidenced at Hopewell, and that may go back much further into the Archaic, then the siting and orientation of their underground structures may have been as carefully calculated as the alignment of the Hopewell earthworks, and the chamber that Sutton described may have been designed to interact with the outside world, not just through the physical passage that connects it to the surface, but through the geometry of light and shadow at specific moments in the time, astronomical calendar. Let us shift our attention now to something more immediate, more personal, more directly relevant to the experience of the two boys and the sensation of being in that space. Let us talk about what it feels like to be underground, and why that feeling has been, across so many cultures and so many historical periods, associated with the sacred and with the transformative. The human nervous system responds to underground environments in specific and consistent ways that are not entirely explained by the ordinary categories of fear and curiosity. There is something that happens in complete darkness, in the specific silence of a cave or a tunnel that is far enough from the surface to be insulated from the sounds of the above-ground world, that alters the quality of attention and the character of consciousness in ways that the laboratory and the field researcher have both noticed. The alteration is not simply a stress response. It is more complex than that. It involves a specific kind of heightening, a sharpening of awareness combined with a loosening of the ordinary boundaries of the self, that has been described in similar terms across cultures that had no contact with each other and that experienced it in different geological and cultural contexts. The people who have studied this phenomenon most carefully are not, primarily, archaeologists. They are psychologists and neuroscientists who became interested in cave environments as laboratories for studying altered states of consciousness. And what they have found is that extended time in underground environments, especially in complete darkness and significant silence, produces measurable changes in brain activity that, in some respects, resemble the states associated with meditation, with sensory deprivation, and with the use of psychoactive substances. These changes are not harmful in controlled conditions. In many cases, they are experienced as profoundly meaningful, as occasions for insight and for a particular kind of clarity that is difficult to achieve in the ordinary above-ground world. This is relevant to the Ozark story because the tradition of seeking sacred knowledge in underground environments, of using the specific qualities of cave and tunnel spaces to alter consciousness in ways that make certain kinds of perception and understanding available, is documented so widely across human cultures and historical periods that it must be considered a genuine and significant element of human spiritual and cognitive practice. From the painted caves of the Paleolithic, to the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, to the Kiva traditions of the American Southwest, to the cave temples of India and Southeast Asia, the underground space has been the site of transformative experience and the repository of sacred knowledge across the entire span of the documented human past. The builders of the Ozarks Passage built in the underground. They went to the considerable trouble of fitting stone in the dark, of creating a constructed environment where a natural cave environment already existed, of making the underground space into something intentionally shaped, something designed. They did not do this for storage, not at the depth and with the sophistication that the surviving evidence suggests. They did it because the underground space had qualities they valued and intended to preserve and enhance. What qualities? The darkness, certainly. The silence. The specific temperature and humidity conditions that the limestone karst maintains at a consistent level, regardless of the season above ground. The acoustic properties of the fitted stone chambers, and perhaps, if the structures were oriented in ways we have not yet been able to assess, the capacity to receive and focus specific qualities of light at specific astronomical moments. These qualities, in the context of a culture with a tradition of seeking transformation and knowledge through altered states, would have made the constructed underground chambers of the Ozarks precisely the right kind of space for exactly the kind of practice those traditions describe. Not just a cave to shelter in or to store things in, but a designed environment for specific kinds of human experience that required specific environmental conditions. Conditions that the builders understood well enough to construct deliberately, and that they maintained well enough that they persisted, physically if not culturally, until two boys with candles found their way in through a winter-opened crack in 1922. Let us come now to the question of transmission, of how the knowledge of what was built in the Ozarks Hills has moved through time, in what forms, and at what cost. Knowledge transmission in oral cultures is a subject Western scholarship has only recently begun to take seriously, and even now it tends to underestimate the precision and the durability of oral traditions as archives of historical and geographical information. The assumption, which is embedded in the Western scholarly tradition at a very deep level, is that written records are reliable and oral records are not, that the technology of writing is what makes the preservation of accurate information possible over long periods of time. This assumption is wrong. It is wrong empirically, in the sense that there are documented examples of oral traditions preserving accurate information over periods of thousands of years, with a precision that written records of comparable age could not match. And it is wrong conceptually, in the sense that it misunderstands both the mechanisms of oral transmission and the purposes to which oral traditions are put. The Aboriginal Australian songlines, to take the most extensively documented example, are a form of oral tradition that encodes geographical and ecological information about the Australian landscape in the form of songs that can be followed across thousands of miles of terrain, song by song, each song corresponding to a specific geographical feature or event in the ancestral narrative associated with that feature. The information encoded in the songlines has been verified, in some cases, against geological and archaeological records, and the match is precise. The traditions describe landscape features that were last accessible above ground thousands of years ago, at a time when sea levels were lower and the Australian coastline was significantly different from its current configuration. The oral tradition preserved accurate geographical information about those features for more than 10,000 years. Through the entire period of rising sea levels that transformed the Australian coastline, 10,000 years of accurate geographical information, preserved in song and ceremony, without the technology of writing. This is not an isolated example. It is the most extensively documented example, but it is representative of a capacity for oral transmission that is found across cultures that have not been disrupted from their relationship to their landscapes. The oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the Ozark region and the Great Lakes corridor have been significantly disrupted by colonialism in ways that are documented and that the communities involved are still working to address. But disrupted is not the same as destroyed. The core elements of the traditions, the geographical and historical information that was encoded in forms designed to survive disruption, have in many cases persisted through the colonial period in fragmentary but recognizable form. The tradition of the longhouse beneath the surface, the Cherokee description of a connected system of constructed underground spaces beneath the hill country of the eastern interior, is an example of that persistence. It has survived the removal, the assimilation campaigns, the suppression of indigenous language and ceremony, in a form that is still recognizable as a description of a geographical and historical reality. It is less detailed than it was when the communities that held it were in full relationship with the landscape it describes. But it is there, and it points, as all the other evidence points, toward a constructed subterranean world beneath the hills of the eastern interior that has not yet been honestly investigated. The people who hold the most complete versions of these traditions know what they know. They are not sharing it fully with outside researchers, for reasons we have already discussed and that we will not minimize. But the existence of the traditions, even in fragmentary form, is itself evidence. It tells us that the knowledge of what is beneath the hills has been considered important enough to maintain, even at the cost of the disruption and suppression of the colonial period. You do not maintain traditions about something that does not exist. You maintain traditions about things that matter, about things that have consequences for the people who hold the traditions and for the landscape those people are connected to. The hills matter, the tunnels matter. The knowledge of what is in the tunnels matters. The people who have been maintaining that knowledge through the most disruptive period in their history know this, even when the institutions that are supposed to study the pre-Columbian past do not. That is, perhaps, the most important thing this story has to say. Not about the specific archaeological evidence, which is real but limited. Not about the institutional failures, which are documented but not uniquely surprising. but about the fact that the knowledge of what is beneath the Ozark Hills has been maintained by the people with the deepest connection to it across 2 centuries of systematic suppression. That maintenance is itself a form of evidence, and it points toward a truth that is larger than the specific tunnel that 2 boys found in 1922, and that was sealed before they could return. The truth is that the pre-Columbian past of North America is not a dead past. It is not a subject for the exclusive ownership of Western academic institutions. It is a living heritage, maintained and transmitted, and fought for by the communities whose ancestors created it, and the investigation of that heritage requires their participation not as informants or as consultants, but as primary authorities on the meaning and significance of what their ancestors built. When that investigation is eventually conducted, and we believe it will be, it will produce a picture of the pre-Columbian Americas that is significantly different from the one that has been on offer in the mainstream literature. It will show a continent that was, for thousands of years before European contact, organized in ways that the colonial narrative has chosen not to acknowledge, that built in stone and in the dark and in the light, that maintained knowledge of the sky and the water and the underground world across generations, that traded across continental distances and organized collective labor on monumental scales, and that left, in the physical landscape and in the oral traditions of its descendants, a record that is available to anyone willing to read it honestly. That record includes the tunnel in the Ozark hillside. It includes the fitted stonework and the worked floor and the platform and whatever was on it. It includes the draft of air that has been moving through the passage since before anyone put those stones in the wall. And it includes the testimony of a 14-year-old boy who held a candle up to the joint between 2 stones and knew, in that moment, that the world was larger than the map he had been given. The map is being redrawn, slowly, against resistance, but being redrawn. And when the redrawing is complete, the tunnel in the hillside will be one of the points on the new map, one of the places where the ground opened and showed its depth, one of the moments where the patience of the stone outlasted the institutional patience for managing inconvenient evidence. Until then, the draft moves, the stones hold. The question stands open in the limestone and the dark. 2 boys, a candle, a wall in the dark, a morning in 1922 that has not finished happening yet. The end of this account is not the end of the story. It is a pause in the middle of something that began long before 2 boys were born on neighboring farms in the Ozark Hill Country, and that will continue long after the last person who might remember hearing about it has gone. The story belongs to the landscape, to the stone and the water, and the specific quality of darkness inside a limestone hill in the southern Ozarks, and to the people who built what is there, and the people who have maintained the memory of it, and the people who will eventually investigate it honestly. We are in the middle of that story. We have been in the middle of it since before we knew there was a story to be in, and the middle is exactly the right place to rest, because it is from the middle that the whole arc becomes visible. The long reach back into the pre-Columbian past, and the long reach forward into the future investigation that will eventually settle the questions this account has raised. Rest in the middle. The story continues without you, in the limestone and the dark, in the oral traditions and the suppressed archives and the draft of air that moves through the passage regardless of whether anyone is there to feel it. It is enough to have followed the question this far. It is enough to hold the complexity honestly, to resist both the easy dismissal and the grand simplification, to stay with the evidence where it leads and acknowledge the gaps where they exist. That is the appropriate relationship to a mystery that is not yet solved and that will take longer to solve than any one account can contain. The hills are patient, the water is patient, the stone is patient, the draft moves. Sleep now. The question will still be there in the morning, exactly where you left it, waiting with the particular patience of things that have been waiting for a very long time, and that have learned, from the experience of waiting, that the right moment always comes eventually. The right moment for the Ozarks Tunnel, the moment of honest investigation conducted with the participation of the communities, with the deepest connection to what is there, and the resources and the authorization to do the work properly. That moment is not yet here, but it is coming. The pressure is building, the way pressure always builds in a karst system, slowly and invisibly, and then all at once in the form of a spring that emerges from the hillside and begins to flow into the ordinary daylight world. When it comes, the spring will carry with it everything the ground has been holding in the dark, and the world will be a little more accurately mapped than it was before. And two boys who held candles up to the joints between carefully fitted stones on a summer morning 100 years ago will have been, in whatever way such things work across the distance of time, vindicated. Rest. The water moves. The draft carries the cold air of the underground out through the sealed entrance, through the rubble and the limestone slurry, into the Ozark morning that is always there, always the same morning, always the moment just before the world becomes larger than the map. You have been listening to a story about what the ground contains, about the long patience of stone and water and the shorter impatience of human curiosity, trying to make sense of a world that is older and stranger than the frameworks we have built to contain it. The story is not finished. The tunnels are not empty. The records in the small archives and the oral traditions of the communities with the deepest connection to this landscape have not been fully read. The investigations that would answer the most important questions have not yet been authorized. But the evidence is there, and the questions are there, and the land is there, waiting with the patience of an entity that has been keeping its records in stone and water for a great deal longer than we have been asking it questions. If you have made it this far, you have followed this account through a great many rooms and passages, through the institutional history of American archaeology and the political history of North American colonialism, and the geological reality of the Ozark karst, and the oral traditions of the peoples who have always known what the hills contain. You have followed it because, we think, you already understood that the standard version of the story was too small, that it left things out, that the official record and the full record were not the same thing. You were right. They are not the same thing. The full record is still being assembled. The passage is still there. The room is still there. In the dark, in the cold, in the silence of a limestone hill in the southern Ozarks that has been standing since before anyone thought to give it a name. And somewhere in that room, or in what remains of it, or in the traces left by whatever was carried out of it in a man coat on a summer afternoon in 1922, is a piece of the answer to the question that this story has been asking all along. Who was here? What did they know? What did they build? We are still finding out. The draft moves. The stones hold. The water somewhere beneath us finds its way. There is one more thread we have not fully pulled, and it runs from the Ozarks all the way up into the Canadian provinces, in a direction that the institutional history of North American archaeology has almost completely ignored. It is the thread of the waterfall chambers. In the limestone country of central Ontario, in the territory that the Anishinaabe have occupied since long before any European arrived to record their presence, there is a specific type of landform that geologists call a tufa waterfall, a waterfall that has been building itself out of dissolved calcium carbonate for centuries, creating a layered cliff of porous stone behind the curtain of water that flows over it. These formations are not unique to Ontario. They occur wherever calcium-rich groundwater emerges at the surface and loses its carbon dioxide, precipitating the dissolved minerals as solid stone. They are among the fastest building natural stone formations in the world, adding layers of tufa at rates that can be measured over human lifetimes, and they have been doing this in the interior of the continent for thousands of years. What makes the Ontario tufa formations relevant to this story is what some of them contain behind the waterfall curtain. Not in all cases, not even in most cases, but in enough documented instances to constitute a pattern. Behind certain of these waterfall curtains, accessible only by walking through the falling water, there are spaces, sometimes small, sometimes surprisingly large. And in some of those spaces, the walls are not tufa, they are limestone, and in some instances, those limestone walls show the kind of modification that indicates human presence and human intention. The smooth surfaces, the leveled floors, the fitted blocks. These are not the most dramatic or the most extensively documented examples of subterranean stonework in the eastern interior, but they are among the most physically accessible, because the waterfalls that conceal them are still active, still falling, and can be reached by canoe or by foot along the waterway systems that connect them to the rest of the landscape. And they are, because of that accessibility, the sites where some of the most careful, informal documentation has been conducted by the kind of people who explore these landscapes by canoe and on foot without institutional affiliation or formal authorization, and who have therefore been free to observe and record without the constraint of fitting their observations into a pre-existing framework. The informal documentation of the Ontario waterfall chambers, such as it is, comes from a handful of canoeists and naturalists who noticed the modifications in the limestone behind certain falls and who wrote about what they saw in trip reports and personal correspondence and occasional letters to regional historical societies. The most detailed of these accounts was written by a woman who spent 20 summers paddling the river systems of central Ontario and who documented, over the course of those summers, 7 separate waterfall sites at which she found evidence of limestone modification behind the curtain of falling water. Her account, which runs to about 40 pages and is illustrated with photographs of uncertain quality, is held by a canoe club in a small Ontario town and has been read by perhaps 100 people. What she describes, in the most specific of her documented sites, is a space approximately 12 feet wide and 30 feet deep behind the waterfall, with a ceiling that rises up about 6 feet at the entrance, just inside the curtain of water, to about 10 feet at the back. The walls of the space are natural limestone for the first few feet in from the waterfall, then transition, she says, to something different. Something that looks like the natural limestone has been squared off, like someone took the rough surface of the rock and made it flat and even. She found at the back of the space a ledge of dressed stone about 2 feet high and 4 feet wide, running the full width of the back wall. She found on the ceiling above the ledge a series of marks that she could not identify. She found, in the floor immediately in front of the ledge, a depression that was too regular to be natural, circular in outline and about 2 feet across and several inches deep. She returned to this site on 3 subsequent summers. On the second visit, she brought a friend with a better camera. The photographs from that visit were subsequently lost when the friend's house was damaged by flooding, an irony that she noted in her correspondence with some bitterness. On the third and fourth visits, she was accompanied by different companions who also observed the modifications and who confirmed her description in their own subsequent accounts, which are included as appendices to her 40-page document. This is thin evidence. 40 pages and a few photographs and second-hand accounts from people in a canoe club in Ontario, but it is not nothing. It is a documented instance of limestone modification in a subterranean space in the Great Lakes watershed, observed independently by multiple witnesses in a geological context that makes it physically possible, and in a cultural context, the vast and under-investigated archaeology of the Anishinaabe territory in central Ontario, that makes it historically plausible. And it is consistent with the broader pattern we have been tracing, the pattern of subterranean stone construction distributed along the ancient waterways of the eastern interior, from the Ozarks in the south to the Canadian Shield in the north. The pattern itself is the argument. No single instance of this evidence is conclusive. Each can be individually explained away as misidentification of natural formations, as exaggeration of minor modifications, as the product of observers who were looking for something and found what they were looking for. But the pattern, the consistent appearance of similar features in similar geological contexts along a geographic distribution that follows the ancient river corridors of the interior, is harder to explain away. The conventional explanation for a pattern like this is that there is a common cause, that the pattern is being produced by something real and something distributed, something that was present across the entire geographic range where the pattern appears. The question is what that something is. The answer that the evidence points toward, and that the mainstream literature has chosen not to engage with, is that there was a tradition, a genuine and geographically widespread tradition of subterranean stone construction in the eastern interior of North America practiced by cultures or communities whose identity and chronology we do not yet know, and preserved in the physical landscape in fragments that are slowly accumulating into something coherent enough to force the question to be answered. That tradition is the context for the tunnel that Earl Sutton and Clarence Webb found in 1922. Not an isolated curiosity, not a local anomaly, but an instance of something larger. One data point in a pattern that runs across the continent, from the spring rivers of the Ozark Plateau to the waterfall chambers of central Ontario to the submerged stone features of Lake Huron, a pattern that speaks to a pre-Columbian North America that was doing things we have not yet fully accounted for, and that was connected across what we would now consider enormous distances in ways that the standard model of isolated regional cultures and simple subsistence economies does not capture. The tradition is the story. The tunnel is the door. We are going to linger now, for a little while, on something that is not usually part of the historical or archaeological argument, but that is, we think, important to the full understanding of what this story is about. We are going to linger on the feeling of limestone. Limestone is not a neutral material. It is not neutral geologically, and it is not neutral experientially. Geologically, it is one of the most complex of the common rocks, formed from the accumulated skeletons of marine organisms over hundreds of millions of years, riddled with the passageways carved by the slightly acidic water that has been moving through it since it was first exposed at the surface, capable of dissolving and redepositing its own material in forms ranging from the razor-edged stalactite to the smooth flow of a cave pearl to the tufa cliff of an Ontario waterfall. It is a rock that is in constant, slow, geological conversation with the water and the atmosphere, always changing, always exchanging, always in the process of becoming something slightly different from what it was. Experientially, limestone is the stone that keeps its temperature. Underground limestone, insulated from the seasonal variation of the surface, maintains a temperature very close to the mean annual air temperature of the region above it, which in the southern Ozarks is somewhere around 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature feels cold in summer and warm in winter, and it feels, always, like it belongs to a different time than whatever the surface is doing. It feels like the past, not in a sentimental or metaphorical sense, but in a physical sense, because the temperature you are feeling when you put your hand on a deep cave wall is the temperature that was in the air above the cave during the last century or so of annual means, averaged out and stored in the rock and slowly released. You are touching, in a literal sense, the accumulated recent past of the climate above you. The people who built in limestone understood this. They understood that the underground was not just a different space but a different time, that to go into the limestone was to step out of the immediate flux of the surface world into something more stable and more permanent, something that changed on geological rather than human timescales. The constructed underground was therefore not just spatially different from the surface world but temporally different, and that difference was part of its value. Whatever was done in the underground, whatever knowledge was kept there, or ceremonies performed there, or objects placed on platforms there, was being placed in the care of geological time rather than human time, committed to a permanence that the surface world, with its seasons and its weather and its social upheavals, could not provide. Earl Sutton understood this without having the vocabulary to describe it. He says, in the account preserved by Robert Dillard, that when he touched the wall and felt the joint between the stones, he felt that whatever had made it was very old. He does not use those exact words. The transcription is imprecise, and the wire recording was imperfect, and the memory was 40 years old. But the sense of his description is clear. The fitted stone felt, to him, not just constructed but ancient, not just made by human hands but made by human hands that had been dust for a very long time. He felt, he says, like he was touching something that had been waiting. The waiting is the most important thing. Whatever is in the tunnel has been waiting. It waited through the centuries before Earl Sutton was born. It waited through the summer of 1922 and the weeks between the boy's discovery and the filling of the entrance. It waited through the decades while Gately wrote his pamphlet and Dillard recorded his interview, and the transcript sat in its folder in the library. It is still waiting. The limestone does not care about the institutional frameworks of American archaeology or the political history of North American colonialism. It keeps its temperature, it keeps its records, it keeps its waiting, and there is something in the specific quality of that waiting that is worth naming, because it is not passive waiting. Limestone is not passive. It is engaged, always, with the water moving through it, and the atmosphere pressing against it, and the living things growing on its surface, and the time piling up inside it, in the form of calcite layers and crystal formations, and the slow calcification of whatever has been left in contact with its walls long enough for the mineral-rich water to coat it in stone. The tunnel, if it is intact, is not the same tunnel that Earl Sutton entered in 1922. It is older by 100 years of ongoing geological process. It has been changed by whatever water has moved through it and whatever calcite has deposited on its surfaces. It has been waiting, but it has also been working, in the way limestone always works, slowly and invisibly, and in the direction of permanence. When the tunnel is finally investigated, if it is finally investigated, the geological work of the past century will itself be data. The rate of calcite deposition on the fitted stone surfaces will give a constraint on the age of the stonework. The accumulation of sediment on the worked floor will give information about the history of water movement through the space. The condition of the platform in the center will tell you something about what it was made of and how it was constructed. The space itself, transformed by a century of waiting, will speak about its history in the language of geological time, which is the most reliable language available for the questions we are trying to answer. This is why the physical investigation matters. Even now, even after 100 years of institutional management and a century of geological change, the site is not degraded by time. It is enriched by it, in the sense that time has added layers of information that were not there when the boys first entered. The calcite that has formed on the surfaces since 1922 is a record of those 100 years. The sediment that has settled on the floor is a record of the water events that move through the system. The condition of the objects in the space, whatever remains of them, reflects the specific microenvironment that the constructed stone has maintained across the entire period of its sealed existence. The waiting is data. The patience of the stone is data. Everything that has been happening in the dark since the rubble was poured over the entrance in 1922 is information that will be available to anyone who goes back in with the right questions and the right tools. And that is, finally, the most hopeful thing in this story. Not the existence of the tunnel, though that is important. Not the breadth of the pattern of which it is a part, though that is significant. But the fact that the evidence has not been lost. It has been sealed, which is not the same thing as destroyed. The institutional management of the site has been, inadvertently, a form of preservation. By sealing the entrance rather than excavating and removing the contents, the decision made in 1922 has kept the site physically intact for whatever future investigation eventually takes place. The man in the city suit, the Bureau of Ethnology coordinator whose name Howard Gately could not find in the records, made a choice that in retrospect looks like the wrong choice for the wrong reasons, but that has had, at least in terms of the physical preservation of the site, a consequence that is better than what a hurried and unauthorized excavation in 1922 would have produced. The irony is almost too perfect. The cover-up preserved the evidence. The institutional reflex to seal and silence has maintained, in the dark, the very thing it was trying to contain. And when the seal is eventually broken, when the right combination of authorization and will and community consultation makes the investigation possible, the evidence will be there, waiting with the patience of stone, more complete and more informative than it would have been if the entrance had been left open in 1922 and the site had been freely accessible to the next 100 years of curious visitors. This is not an argument for cover-ups. It is an observation about how time works on evidence, and about how the specific actions taken to manage the Ozarks site have had consequences that were not intended and that are, in their way, a kind of gift to the future investigation that the actors in 1922 were trying to prevent. The gift is there, in the limestone, in the dark, waiting with all the patience that geological time permits. And we find ourselves, having followed this story through its multiple dimensions, its specific evidence, and its broad context, and its institutional history, and its physical geography, and its cultural connections, back at the beginning, back at the hillside, back at the cedar trees growing sideways out of the limestone with their particular Ozark determination to find the light regardless of the angle, back at the spring running cold from its source somewhere below the surface of the hill, back at the silence that belongs to a landscape that has been keeping its secrets for longer than anyone has been asking. Two boys, a summer morning, a draft of air from somewhere deep. Everything else radiates from that. The copper and the earthworks and the petroglyphs and the oral traditions and the suppressed reports and the institutional failures and the patience of the stone. All of it is context for that one moment of contact, the candle and the wall and the knowledge that someone had been there before, had placed that stone with intention, had built something in the dark that was still there to be found after however many centuries of geological waiting. That is the story. That is where it begins and where it returns. The specific moment of a specific discovery, followed by a century of institutional management that has preserved in its containment the very thing it meant to suppress. The question is open. The site is intact. The investigation has not yet happened, but the draft is still moving. Follow it. There is a quality of attention that the Ozark Hill Country demands that is different from what most landscapes demand. You cannot move through it quickly and see it clearly. The terrain does not permit it. The hills fold into each other in ways that confuse direction. The hollows look the same from above and are entirely distinct on the ground. The bluffs appear and disappear depending on the season and the height of the vegetation and the angle of the light. To know the Ozarks, you have to move slowly and you have to pay the kind of attention that has almost entirely disappeared from modern life. The attention that tracks small changes in the quality of the air and the behavior of the birds and the way the light falls differently in this hollow than it fell in the one you came through an hour ago. Earl Sutton had that attention. He grew up in a landscape that required it, and he exercised it from the time he was old enough to follow his father on foot through the hill country around their farm. By the time he was 14, he knew the hillside where the tunnel was located, the way most children know the rooms of their own houses. Every feature of it familiar and named in his private geography, which is why, when he put his hand on the wall in the passage and felt what was wrong about it, he knew immediately that it was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of frightening, though it was that too. Wrong in the sense of impossible within the map of the world he had been given. Stone did not get fitted together in hillsides in the southern Ozarks in 1922. Stone did not get fitted together in hillsides anywhere on this continent before the Europeans arrived, as far as the world he had been given was concerned. And yet there it was, under his hand, in the light of the candle, perfectly fitted, clearly intentional, impossible. That impossibility is the heart of the story, not the mystery of who built it, which is the question that opens out into the enormous historical and archaeological territory we have been exploring, but the more immediate, and in some ways more profound experience of encountering something that should not exist and knowing, with the direct knowledge of the hand on the stone, that it does exist, that the map is wrong, that the world is larger than the map. That experience is available to anyone who pays enough attention to the world that they notice when something does not fit. It is the experience that drives genuine inquiry, the experience that makes people spend decades on questions that the institutions around them have decided are not worth asking. It is the experience that drove Howard Gately to spend 3 years interviewing people in the hill country, looking for someone who had been present when the entrance was filled in. It is the experience that drove the researcher with the petroglyphs to apply and be denied, and apply again and be denied again, and keep going back to the site in the summers, because the map keeps telling her that something is there that the map does not show. The map is wrong. That is the starting point for all of this, and it is also, in a way, the ending point. The map of pre-Columbian North America that has been given to us by the institutions that study it is wrong in ways that matter. in ways that have consequences, in ways that can be demonstrated by the accumulated evidence of a century of anomalies that the map has been unable to absorb. The map will change. It is already changing, slowly, in the margins and against the grain of the institutional inertia that has maintained it. And when it changes fully, when the accumulated evidence finally forces the revision that the evidence has been demanding for generations, the map that replaces it will show a continent that is more complex and more ancient and more fully human than the one we have been given. That map will have, somewhere in the southern Ozarks, a mark for the tunnel that two boys found in 1922. It will have, in the Great Lakes watershed, marks for the waterfall chambers and the submerged stone structure and the anomalous passages in the shield. It will have, in the Louisiana Delta country, a mark for Poverty Point, and it will show Poverty Point not as an exceptional outlier, but as one of many centers in a network that extended across the entire interior of the continent. It will have, along the ancient river corridors and the old copper routes and the astronomical alignments of the Hopewell earthworks, the evidence of a civilization that the current map has been too small to contain. And it will have, somewhere in the margins, in the places where the map acknowledges what it does not yet know, the unresolved questions, the identity of the subterranean builders, the full extent of the constructed network beneath the eastern hills, the meaning of the ceramic object on the platform in the room that Earl Sutton described, the specific astronomical alignments, if any, of the constructed passages, the full content of the oral traditions that the communities with the deepest connection to these sites continue to maintain and to protect. Those questions will take longer to answer. Some of them may not be answerable with the tools currently available, but the map that acknowledges them honestly, that holds them as genuine open questions rather than managing them as inconvenient anomalies, will be a better map than the one we have now. It will be a map that corresponds more closely to the actual complexity of the human past in this part of the world, and that is a better basis for understanding who we are and how we got here than the simplified version that the institutional history of American archaeology has constructed. We are building toward that map, not in this account, which is too limited and too reliant on fragmentary evidence to do the construction directly, but in the accumulation of attention that accounts like this one contribute to, in the growing body of work by researchers at the margins of the mainstream, and by indigenous scholars bringing their community knowledge into engagement with the academic literature, and by the physical scientists whose methods are slowly making it possible to date and characterize the material, evidence in ways that the framework cannot continue to ignore. The map is being redrawn. The tunnel is one of its fixed points. And now, finally, truly, we should rest. Not because the story is resolved, it is not, but because the hour is late and the darkness is patient, and the questions have been asked as fully as this account can ask them. The evidence is laid out. The context is established. The pattern is visible to anyone willing to see it. And the specific tunnel in the specific hillside in the southern Ozarks is exactly where it has always been, sealed and dark and full of whatever it has always been full of, waiting with the particular patience of a place that has never needed anyone to acknowledge it in order to remain real. It is real. It has always been real. The institutional management of the evidence has not made it less real, only less accessible. And the inaccessibility is not permanent. Nothing is permanent except the stone, and even the stone changes, slowly, in geological time. The draft moves through the sealed entrance. The spring runs cold from the hillside. The cedar trees grow sideways in the pale morning light of an Ozark morning that has been going on for longer than anyone has been counting the days. Two boys found the entrance in 1922. Someone filled it in. The entrance is still there beneath the fill. The passage is still there beyond the entrance. The room is still there at the end of the passage. The platform is still there in the center of the room. And whatever the platform holds, whatever remains after 100 years of dark and cold and the slow, patient work of geological time, is there too. Waiting. It has always been waiting. Let it wait a little longer. Let the night do what nights do, which is to hold the things that the daylight cannot quite contain. The questions. the mysteries, the sense of a world that is larger and older and stranger than the map we have been given, a world that keeps announcing its own excess whenever someone pays enough attention to notice. The hills are announcing it now, in their patient Ozark silence. The stone is announcing it, in the particular coolness of limestone that has been underground since long before anyone was there to measure its temperature. The draft is announcing it, moving through the passage from wherever the pressure difference sends it, indifferent to the rubble fill, indifferent to the institutional frameworks, indifferent to the 100 years of managed silence, just moving, the way air moves when it has somewhere to go. Follow the draft in your mind. Follow it through the sealed entrance and the rubble fill and the limestone passage and the branching point and the descending passage, and into the room where two boys held their candles up and saw something they spent the rest of their lives trying to explain. Stay there for a moment, in the dark, in the cold, with the fitted stones around you and the worked floor beneath you and the platform in the center and whatever is on it. Whatever the man in the city suit left behind when he carried out what he carried out, whatever the geological time of the past century has added or preserved or transformed, stay there, in the quiet of a place that has not been disturbed in 100 years, and let the knowledge settle that this place is real, that it was built, that it has been waiting, and that the waiting is not over but is, with every year and every accumulating piece of evidence, and every researcher who refuses to be managed out of the question, getting incrementally closer to its end. The end of the waiting is the beginning of the understanding, and the understanding, when it comes, will change the map. Sleep now. The hills will keep the secret a little longer. The stone will keep its patience. The draft will keep moving, and the morning will come, when it always comes, without fail. For the same hills and the same springs and the same cedar trees that have been there for longer than any of us have been counting. Good night. Rest well. The tunnel is still there, and so is the question. And so, beneath the question and beneath the tunnel and beneath the limestone and the old cool dark of the Ozark hill country, so are you. Part of the same long story, part of the same deep time, part of the same patient world that keeps its records in stone and water and the movement of air through sealed passages and the oral traditions of people who have never lost their connection to what is beneath the hills. You belong to that story. Everyone does. It is older than any of us, and it will outlast all of us, and it is happening right now, in the dark, in the limestone, with the patience of a world that has never needed any of us to acknowledge it in order to keep being real. Good night. Rest in that. There is something specific and important that we have not yet said about the year 1922, not about the boys or the tunnel, but about the broader context in which the discovery was made and in which the institutional response to it took the shape it did. Because 1922 was not a neutral year in the history of American archaeology or in the history of the relationship between Western institutions and the indigenous peoples of the Eastern Interior. It was a year embedded in a specific moment in that history, a moment that shaped the response to the Sutton Webb discovery as powerfully as any individual decision by any individual actor. The early 1920s were the height of what historians of American anthropology have called the allotment era, the period following the passage of the Dawes Act in 1887, during which the remaining communal lands of indigenous peoples across the United States were being systematically divided into individual allotments and sold off to non-indigenous buyers, a process that transferred approximately 90 million acres of indigenous land into non-indigenous ownership between 1887 and 1934. In the Ozark region specifically, the Osage people, who had been the dominant culture in the area before their forced removal to Oklahoma in the early 19th century, were in the middle of a decade that would become one of the most dramatic chapters in the history of American crime, the Osage Reign of Terror, in which dozens of Osage people were murdered by non-indigenous conspirators seeking to inherit the oil rights that the Osage had managed to retain despite the allotment process. In this context, the discovery by two farm boys of a constructed underground chamber in a Missouri hillside was not a politically neutral event. The land on which the discovery was made was, in 1922, privately owned by a non-indigenous family. The relevant cultural and historical claim to the site belonged to the Osage, and potentially to other indigenous peoples with historical connections to the Ozark region. The Bureau of Ethnology, the federal agency whose representative appears in the expense reports that Howard Gately found in the regional archive, was at that time an agency whose mission was officially the documentation and study of indigenous cultures, but whose actual function in many cases was the management of information about those cultures in ways that served the broader project of assimilation and dispossession. The decision to seal the entrance to the tunnel was therefore not made in a vacuum. It was made by an institution with a specific interest in controlling the narrative of pre-Columbian North America, at a moment when that narrative was actively serving the legal and political project of erasing indigenous claims to the land. A site that demonstrated the presence of sophisticated pre-Columbian construction in the Ozark Hill Country would have complicated the story that the dispossession required, the story of an empty or near-empty land awaiting productive development by the arriving civilization. The man in the city suit, whoever he was, understood this. We cannot know what he thought or felt when he saw the entrance to the tunnel and went in and spent 20 minutes in the passage before coming out with his wrapped object and giving instructions for the fill. We cannot know whether he recognized the significance of what he had seen and chose to suppress it, or whether his institutional framework was sufficiently limited that he genuinely did not understand what he was looking at. But we can know that the decision he made was consistent with the institutional interests he represented, and that those institutional interests were, in 1922, deeply invested in a particular narrative of the pre-Columbian past. That narrative is still, 100 years later, the dominant one, but it is under more pressure than it has ever been. The political context has changed. The legal frameworks have changed. The indigenous communities whose ancestors built what is beneath the Ozark Hills have more voice in the academic and political conversations about their heritage than they did in 1922. And the evidence has been accumulating, slowly and in the margins and against the institutional grain, in ways that the dominant narrative is becoming increasingly unable to contain. The Osage people know their history. They know the Reign of Terror and the Allotment Era and the long century of institutional management of the information that would support their claims. They know what was done to the land and to the knowledge of the land in the decades around 1922. And they are, in various ways and through various mechanisms, working to recover what was taken and to tell the story of their past in their own terms, rather than in the terms that the institutions that suppressed it have constructed. That recovery is part of the context in which the investigation of the Ozarks Tunnel, when it eventually happens, will take place. It will not be a purely archaeological investigation. It will be a negotiation between communities with different histories and different interests and different relationships to the evidence, and the outcome of that negotiation will determine not just what is found, but what the finding means. This is as it should be. The past does not belong to the institutions that have been managing it. It belongs to the people whose ancestors created it, and the process of recovering it honestly requires their participation and their authority, not as subjects of study but as primary agents in the determination of what the evidence means and what should be done with it. The hill in southern Missouri, the spring that runs from its base, the sealed entrance in the limestone bluff face, the constructed passage and the branching tunnels, and the room with its platform, all of this is part of that inheritance. It belongs, in the deepest sense of belonging, to the people whose ancestors built it, and who have maintained the memory of it, across the entire disrupted century since two boys with candles found the entrance and brought the secret too close to the surface. The secret is not a secret anymore. It has been a documented historical problem for decades. What remains is the investigation, the honest and collaborative inquiry that will eventually answer the questions that the sealed entrance has been holding in suspension since 1922, and that inquiry will happen, because the evidence is there and the pressure is growing and the frameworks for conducting it responsibly are developing, slowly and imperfectly but developing. When it happens, the world will be a little more honest than it was before, a little more complete, a little more accurately mapped, and the Ozark Hills will continue to stand in their ancient silence, holding whatever they hold, indifferent as always to the human dramas playing out on their surface, patient in the way that only very old things can be patient. The draft moves. The stone holds. The question waits for its answer. 2 boys found the door in 1922. The door is still there. Someone will open it. Let us speak plainly, one last time, about what we do not know. We do not know exactly what Earl Sutton and Clarence Webb found in that hillside in the summer of 1922. We know what Sutton said he found, 40 years later, in an imperfect transcription of an imperfect wire recording. We know that his account is internally consistent and that it has been corroborated in its most specific details by the independent account of Hector, the man Howard Gately found in the hill country, who had been present when the entrance was sealed. We know that the geographic and geological context is consistent with the existence of exactly the kind of feature Sutton describes. We know that there are analogous features documented at multiple sites across the eastern interior of the continent, and that those analogous features have been consistently managed by the institutional systems of American and Canadian archaeology in ways that reflect institutional interest rather than evidential assessment. We know that the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples of the region describe, with a consistency that crosses cultural and linguistic boundaries, a tradition of subterranean stone construction by a prior people, a tradition that corresponds in its geographical and architectural specifics to what Sutton described. What we do not know is the identity of the builders, the age of the construction, the full extent of the constructed system, the specific purpose of the room and the platform, and the object that was taken from it, or the current physical condition of the site beneath the rubble fill. Those unknowns are the substance of the open question that this account has been trying to establish, and they will remain open until the investigation that can answer them is authorized and conducted. We also do not know whether that investigation will ever happen. The obstacles are real. The politics are complicated. The institutional momentum is formidable, but the evidence is real, and the pressure is real, and the world is, slowly, becoming more willing to ask honestly what the pre-Columbian past of North America actually contains. Whether that willingness will extend to the specific hillside in the southern Ozarks within our lifetimes is genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is the significance of the question. What is not uncertain is the existence of the pattern of evidence that surrounds the specific tunnel and that constitutes the case for taking the question seriously. What is not uncertain is the patience of the stone and the water and the oral traditions and the draft of air moving through the sealed passage into the Ozark morning, all of them waiting for the same moment of honest engagement that the institutional history of the past century has so far managed to postpone. That is enough to say. The question is stated, the evidence is laid. The wait continues, with a particular quality of patience that belongs to things that are very old and very sure of themselves, and entirely indifferent to the timescales of any individual human life. We will leave you with the hillside, the cedar trees, the spring, the silence, and the particular coolness of limestone on the palm of a hand in the dark. That coolness is the beginning and the end of the story. It is what Earl Sutton felt in 1922, and what the wall has been waiting to be felt again ever since. Touch the wall. Stay as long as you need. The morning will come, and while you wait for the morning, consider what mornings have meant in the Ozark Hill Country across the long span of time we have been tracing. Not just the morning of 1922 when 2 boys carried their candles into the hillside, and not just the mornings of the settlers and farmers who came before them and after them, but the mornings of the people who came before all of them, the people who built what is there in the dark, the people whose descendants remember the longhouse beneath the surface, in traditions that have survived 2 centuries of disruption and suppression and assimilation. Those mornings were the same mornings in the geological sense, the same sun rising over the same hills, the same spring running from the same limestone, the same cedar trees catching the same light at the same angle that they have been catching it for longer than any of us can hold in our minds at once. The Ozark Hill Country has been receiving warnings for a very long time. It has been receiving the attention of human beings for a very long time. And in all that time, through all the cultural changes and political upheavals and geological shifts that have left their marks on the landscape, the hills have maintained their character, their specific quality of old and patient, and full of the kind of knowledge that only accumulates over thousands of years of continuous engagement between a people and a place. That engagement is the deepest thread in this story, not the anomaly, not the suppression, not the institutional history or the political context, or the broad implications for the archaeology of the Americas. Those things matter, and we have spent considerable time on them. But beneath all of them, older than all of them, is the engagement. The long human relationship with this particular stretch of limestone hill country in the southern interior of the continent, a relationship that began before anyone thought to call it the Ozarks or Missouri or America, that produced the springs and the trails and the constructed passages and the oral traditions and the specific attention to this landscape that allowed Earl Sutton, at 14, to know immediately that the wall under his hand was wrong. That knowledge, the knowledge of the land that comes from generations of attention, is the thing that the institutional management of the past century has been least able to suppress. You can fill in an entrance, you can reclassify a report, you can decline to publish a paper or authorize a research proposal, but you cannot erase the knowledge that is carried in the relationship between a people and their landscape, because that knowledge is not stored in documents or artifacts but in the living practice of paying attention, and the living practice continues, however disrupted and however changed, as long as the people continue and as long as the landscape continues. Both continue. The people whose ancestors built in the limestone hills of the Ozark Plateau are here. The hills are here. The relationship, damaged but not destroyed, is here. And the morning is coming, as it always comes, over the same hills, into the same limestone valley, touching the same spring water, with the same light that has been falling on this landscape for longer than anyone has been counting the years. Be here for it. That is enough. The hills are patient. They have always been patient. They were patient through the ice ages, and the warm periods, and the flood episodes, and the long dry spells, and the arrival of the people who built in their limestone interiors, and the departure of those people, and the arrival of the next. People and the disruptions of the colonial period, and the filling in of the entrance, and the 100 years of institutional silence that followed. Through all of it, the hills were patient, doing what hills do, which is stand and receive the weather, and channel the water, and hold in their limestone interiors the records of everything that has happened on and in them since they were first lifted out of the ancient sea that deposited them. Those records are there, in the chemistry of the stone, in the layers of calcite that have been accumulating on the constructed surfaces since the day the builders set their last block in place and walked back out through the passage into the Ozark daylight, in the sediment on the worked floor, in the condition of the platform and whatever remains on it after the slow, patient work of a century of geological time. The records are there, and they are waiting, as the hills have always waited, for the moment when the question is asked with enough clarity and enough honesty and enough respect for the people whose ancestors created what the records describe to deserve the answer. That moment is coming, perhaps not soon, but certainly eventually. The hills will be here when it arrives, the records will be here, and the answer, when it comes, will be worth the waiting. Good night. If this journey through the hills and the dark and the deep time of the continent helped you rest a little easier tonight, you can leave a gentle like on the video and subscribe so you do not miss the next story, which will take us somewhere else in the long and mostly untold history of this continent. And if you feel moved to leave a comment, we would love to know where in the world you are listening from, what the night looks like from where you are, what time it is in your corner of this ancient world. Someone in the Ozarks might be listening to a story about their own hills. Someone in Canada might be listening to a story about the lakes and the granite they have always known. Someone on the other side of the planet might be hearing for the first time that the hills of the American interior are as old and as full of mystery as anywhere on Earth. That is a quiet kind of miracle, all of us connected in the dark by the same long story. Rest well. The hills are patient. The answers come in their own time, from the dark, more complete than we expected, older than we imagined, more human than we feared. Good night. The draft moves through the sealed entrance one more time, carrying with it the coolness of the deep limestone and the specific quality of silence that belongs to spaces that have not been disturbed for a very long time. It finds its way out through the interstices of the rubble fill, disperses into the thin air of the hillside, joins the ordinary atmosphere of an Ozark morning that has been going on for so much longer than this account of it. And somewhere behind it, in the dark, in the cold, in the careful geometry of fitted limestone and worked floors, and a platform in the center of a room that no one has entered in 100 years, the record waits. Patient, complete, real, ready for the morning when the question is finally asked clearly enough to deserve its answer. And somewhere in that record, fitted stone by fitted stone, in the dark below a hillside in the southern Ozarks, two boys left their handprints in the history of a continent that was never as empty or as simple as the people who came to fill it needed it to be. The draft moves. Still. Always. Real.